Weird Science, Dark Stars, 5 stories by Edmond Hamilton. Fessenden's Worlds. I wish now that I'd never seen Fessenden's damnable experiment. I wish my cursed curiosity had never taken me into his laboratory that night, to witness the thing that destroyed my peace of mind forever, and made me for the rest of my life a somber and soul-sick man. Arnold Fessenden was the greatest scientist this planet ever produced, and the evilest. I know. I'd have told about it before, but I knew that I wouldn't be believed. He assured me of that himself, grinning with sardonic mirth at me. That night he showed me what I'd like to forget. It was a dark, wet, windy night in late October when I climbed the porch of Fessenden's big stone house near the campus and rang the bell. He lived there quite alone now, I knew. Even his housekeeper had finally declared that she couldn't stand his queer ways any longer. He came to the door himself, his big, powerful figure bulking against the dimly lit hall inside. He stared out at me and said, "Oh, it's you, Bradley. What do you want?" I told him, "That's a poor way to receive guests. I just came over to gab a little. Haven't seen you around the campus lately." He hesitated a moment, then said, "I'm sorry, Bradley. I haven't had many guests of late. Come on in." I went in and sat down in the slovenly-looking living room. Fessenden sat in a chair and looked across at me with a queer mocking light in his piercing black eyes and a sardonic smile on his flat, strong face. I said, "Fessenden, why haven't you shown up at any of the faculty meetings lately? They tell me you've been letting a substitute take care of all your lecture courses, too." Fessenden looked at me with that mocking smile and said, "What I like about you, Bradley, is that you're so transparent. You've heard everyone around the campus saying that I've got a little crazy, so you've come over to see for yourself." "No, that's not so," I protested. "It's true that a good many people have been ridiculing those radical astrophysical theories you propounded, and that some of them think you're more than a little eccentric, but that means nothing to me. I know very well that whenever a man proposes something new, everyone at first thinks he's a little crazy." I continued earnestly. "You know, I'm only a foot soldier in the ranks of science myself, a poor devil of an instructor. Nevertheless, I've always recognized you as a great pioneer. I've been wondering a lot just what you've been working on here so intensively, and I'm honestly hoping you'll tell me something about it. But whether you do or not, you have my admiration and sympathy." Fessenden's smile deepened. He told me, "Bradley, if you expect me to be grateful for your sympathy, you're wrong. I'm not. I've been called cold and unfeeling, and that is just what I want to be. The gabbling of the fools who have been ridiculing me does not disturb me, and means no more to me than does your sympathy." My face must have fallen a little. Fessenden laughed. "I'm glad that is clear to you," he said. "But now that it is, let me tell you that I have decided that I will show you what I am doing after all. I'll show you the greatest experiment which any scientist on Earth has ever conducted." I said, in surprise, "If you feel no more friendliness for me than you say, I don't see why you should." He shrugged mockingly. "Because, unfortunately, I am still an ordinary human being at bottom, Bradley. As such, I have a certain ineradicable amount of exhibitionism in me, which, deplore it as I may, persists and makes me want to show at least somebody what I have done." He laughed. "Just like any small boy who has built his first kite and wants somebody to see it." I recognize the folly of this. I am amused by it, but I can't wholly eliminate it from my makeup. Well, why not indulge this irrational desire for applause by demonstrating to you what I've done? You do not have enough intelligence to comprehend it all, of course. Still, you will be an auditor, an audience, and I shall satisfy this itch of mine to let someone know what I've accomplished." I said quickly, "I promise that I'll keep everything you tell me absolutely confidential." Fessenden roared with laughter. "You needn't promise that. For all I care, you can go out and tell the whole world what you see here. Only, if you do, they'll call you a madman, and very likely confine you in an institution. By all means, go ahead and tell them, if you want to." He was still chuckling as he rose to his feet. "It's back in my laboratory, Bradley." "But what is it, anyway?" I asked doubtfully. "What have you done?" "I've created a universe," Fessenden told me. I said impatiently, "That's a grandiose metaphor, but just what does it mean?" "It's not a metaphor at all," Fessenden said blandly. "I mean literally that I have created a universe in my laboratory. A universe that has millions of suns, tens of millions of worlds." I was silent. I was trying to avoid his eyes, to hide my disappointment from him. Fessenden chuckled. "A minute ago," he said, "you were condemning the rest of the university for thinking me insane. Now you're thinking exactly the same thing, aren't you? Wondering how you can get out of this crazy Fessenden's house with good grace." He added, grinning sardonically, "Come along to the laboratory, Bradley, and see for yourself." I followed his tall, powerful figure along the corridor. I did think now that his isolation and the ridicule his radical theories had evoked must have touched his mind. But still, he must have something to show me, and I was eager to see what it was. The laboratory was a long, stone-walled room whose walls were crowded with shelves of chemical and physical apparatus, and whose corners held great electrical mechanisms. Much of the equipment I saw was strange to my eyes. Then my gaze fastened on the thing at the center of the laboratory. It consisted of two 12-foot metal discs with grid-like surfaces, one on the floor and one on the ceiling directly over the other. They were connected by cables to the electrical machinery, and their grid-like surfaces shone faintly with one blue light or force. Between the two discs, floating unsupported in the air, hung a cloud of tiny sparks of light. It looked like a swarm of minute golden bees, countless in number, and the swarm was lenticular in shape. Mounted near this weird thing were several instruments that looked a little like telescopes, though unfamiliar in design. They seemed to be trained upon that thick little cloud of shining sparks. Fessenden walked over to the thing and motioned calmly toward the blue-glowing discs in floor and ceiling. "These discs, Bradley, neutralize all the ordinary gravitational forces of Earth in the space between them." "What?" I cried, astonished. I stepped forward, was about to thrust my hand between the two discs to test the assertion, but Fessenden held me back. "Don't try that," he warned. "The human body is accustomed to Earth's gravitation, and is inwardly braced against it. If you were to step between those discs out of Earth's gravitation, your body would explode from its own inward pressure, just as a deep-sea fish will explode when it is suddenly brought up from the tremendous pressures of its usual depths to the surface." Fessenden added, gesturing to the floating swarm of sparks between the discs. "It was necessary that this should be outside Earth's gravitational influences, for this is the universe I have created." I stared from him to the shining swarm, and then back again to his dark, amused face. "Those little flecks of light? A universe?" "Just that," he assured me. "Look closer at them, Bradley." I looked closer, and I felt a weird chill creeping over me. Those points of light were so infinitesimal that I could barely distinguish them one from another, and I knew there must be millions of them in this thick swarm. Yet there were some oddly familiar features about them. Some of the tiny sparks were blazing white in color, others smoky red, others golden yellow, the colors of suns in our own universe. Some of them were in double or triple groups, and here and there were clusters of them that contained thousands, and here and there, too, were little glowing patches that looked like tiny nebulae, and crawling sparks with tails of light like Lilliputian comets, just as the floating sparks looked like tiny suns. Those sparks were tiny suns. I knew it beyond doubt, even while my brain fought against the knowledge and called it impossible. I knew that I was looking at a miniature universe, one on a scale many billions of times smaller than our own universe, yet one that was comparatively as large in extent as our own, a little microcosm floating here in Fessenden's laboratory. Fessenden's eyes had been following my stupefied change of expression. He said calmly, "Yes, Bradley, it is true. That is a tiny, self-sustaining universe, with its own suns, nebulae, and worlds. Everything in it, down to the atoms which compose it, is infinitely smaller in scale than our own. But it is a real universe, like our own." "And you say you created this?" I gasped. Fessenden nodded. "Yes, I did. After many failures, I succeeded in bringing that universe into being only a few weeks ago. I've been experimenting with it ever since." His black eyes flashed a little. "Didn't I tell you that it was the greatest experiment any scientist had ever conducted? Think of what I'm able to do. I can conduct my astrophysical and other experiments on a cosmic scale. I can change or destroy suns and nebulae at will with the instruments I devised. Can observe the minutest details of that tiny universe through my super-magnifying telescopes. I can make observations with the universe itself as my subject." I said in amazement. "But how did you make it? Start it?" Fessenden shrugged. "How did our own universe start, Bradley? As a vast cloud of glowing gas that filled all space. The mutual attraction of the cloud's particles drew them together, so that the cloud condensed into huge nebulae. The nebulae further condensed into suns, which by tidal attraction and occasional collision threw off matter that formed into circling worlds. Well, I started this tiny universe just like that. I filled the non-gravitational space between these disks with a cloud of glowing gas, whose atoms were infinitely tinier than our atoms, because I had contracted their electronic orbits. Then all I had to do was watch, while the same inevitable natural process that eons ago formed our universe formed this little microcosm. I watched as the gas condensed into tiny nebulae. I saw those little nebulae condense further into miniature suns, just as in our own cosmos long ago. And I saw those suns, as their random wanderings brought them close to one another, throw off worlds. Millions on millions of tiny worlds, here in this little microcosm, Bradley. Worlds that I can change and tamper with and destroy at will. Worlds with every conceivable kind of conditions. Worlds whose life I can develop or wither as I wish. That is my experiment, Bradley." "Whose life, you say?" I repeated in a whisper. "On the tiny planets of this microcosm? Life?" "Of course," said Fessenden. "Life always develops automatically on worlds where conditions are favorable, and usually in very much the same forms." He reached toward one of the bulky, unfamiliar telescopic instruments. "Wait, and I shall find such a world for you, Bradley. I shall let you watch its life develop for yourself." He applied his eye to one of the lenses of the bulky telescope instrument, focusing it upon that shining cloud of sparks, turning knobs, twisting, searching, until at last he straightened. "Now look, Bradley." I put my eye to one of the lenses, looked into that cloud of floating sparks. There leaped into my vision, dazzling and gigantic, a huge white sun booming majestically through the darkness of space. Just one of those tiny sparks, seen through the super-magnifying instrument. Fessenden was beside me, gazing through the other lens of the instrument. His fingers were touching the focus knobs, and he said calmly, "Keep watching. You'll see the changes of ages in a few minutes of our time. For, of course, The time of this microcosm runs at an infinitely swifter rate than the time of our vaster universe. As he shifted the focus of the instrument, my gaze seemed to leap toward that great sun. I made out 2 planets that circled it at tremendous speed, a year of their time, no more than a moment of ours. One of these planets was still partly molten, but the other was cooling, its vapor envelope condensing. My vision leaped forward in the telescope until I seemed almost standing on that cooling world. It was a wild, rocky planet, rain falling heavily on its surface from the cloudy sky, water collecting with unbelievable swiftness in seas. Green life came into being on that world, first along the shores of the warm, shallow seas, then creeping out and advancing over the land. Swiftly, vegetation mantled the globe, and now crawling animal life made its appearance as the ages ticked swiftly by. The animal life developed quickly. So rapid were the changes that my gaze could hardly follow them. Warring species of unhuman monsters passed and vanished. Tiny hordes of man-like animals began to throng here and there, to multiply with each passing moment. I saw rude villages of huts spring up on that world. The villages quickly became cities, as that people developed in intelligence, age after microcosmic age. The cities towered higher each moment. Great ships sailed upon the seas. Ages of progress and development were run through before my eyes in tiny moments. I was shaking as I recoiled from the telescope. I cried, "This is all impossible. It can't be real." Fessenden smiled. "Your expressions of stupefaction satisfy my egotistic desire for applause, Bradley. But I assure you that that tiny race and their world are quite real." He chuckled. "No doubt. That little folk think that they have reached such a pinnacle of power and knowledge that nothing can threaten them. We shall see now whether or not they are able to face a real danger." He turned to a curious needle-like instrument and carefully trained it upon that part of the microcosm which held the tiny white spark that was the great sun of the world I had been watching. There was a tiny comet crawling through the swarm some distance from that white sun. Fessenden touched a knob, and from the needle-like instrument a thin, almost invisible filament of force crept into the microcosmic swarm of sparks and touched the little crawling comet. It seemed to veer a tiny bit aside. "Now watch," said Fessenden with amused interest, "and we shall see just how great is the power of that little people." I did not understand, but I looked again with him through the telescope at the tiny world. By now, so swift its development in terms of our time, its cities had become even vaster, and were roofed with glass-like shields. Huge aircraft flashed above them. All seemed peace and progress on that world. Generation after generation ticked by as we watched. Then came a mad stir of movement, a wild scurrying about of the little folk, a swift change in the tempo of their life. A faint green light was now falling upon their planet, the baleful glow of a monster comet that was coming headlong toward it. I knew then that it was the tiny microcosmic comet whose course Fessenden had slightly altered, but in the telescope it was colossal, a huge orb dripping green light across the heavens as it rushed toward that world. Remorselessly it came on. Then that comet struck the planet, and I saw the doom of the little folks' cities. The meteors that were the comet's only solid substance shattered the glass-roofed cities to ruin. The poisonous gases that made up the rest of the comet veiled that whole world in a toxic cloud. The comet passed on as we watched, but its deadly gases had wiped away all life from that planet. It was still and brown and dead now, a lifeless world circling its sun. The ruined cities melted swiftly down into decay and disappeared as we watched. Fessenden's laugh rang in my ears as I stared in stunned horror. "You see? Their knowledge was not enough to save them from the mere slight shifting of the comet's course. You killed them. Killed every soul on that world. My voice throbbed with the horror that I felt. Nonsense. It was just an experiment, Fessenden said. It's no more murder than when a bacteriologist casually destroys germs he experiments with. Those little folk were millions of times smaller than any germ. But they and others like them on the countless worlds of this microcosm provide me with a subject for experimentation which no scientist has ever had before. Look at another world. Here are two that interest me. My vision in the telescope leaped to another sun, for Fessenden had shifted the focus. It was a yellow sun with 4 planets circling it. 2 of them were airless worlds, but the other 2 bore different forms of life, one of them quite manlike, the other verging on the reptilian, each supreme on its own world. Both races had a certain amount of civilization, as was evident from the queer cities on their worlds. There was no contact or communication between them, for the 2 planets were widely separated from each other. Now I wonder, Fessenden was saying interestedly, just what the result would be if those 2 races were to come into contact with each other. Well, we'll soon see, he mused aloud, and reached again toward the needle-like instrument. Again, a ghostly little thread of force stole into the microcosm. I saw its effects through the telescope. One of those planets, beneath the impetus, began to change its orbit. It moved closer and closer toward the other inhabited world. Soon, the 2 were so close together that they had formed an Earth-Moon system, revolving around a common center of gravity as they circled their sun. Soon, very soon, ships began to fly from one world to the other, across the narrowed gulf. Communication had been established, and almost at once came war between the 2 worlds, a conflict of the manlike and reptilian races. Cities were destroyed by flashes of fire in that war. Great throngs went to death in battles of incredible ferocity. The tide turned in favor of the reptilian race. Their invading hordes destroyed the last members of the manlike folk. Then it was all over. The reptilian race reigned supreme over both worlds. I'm a little surprised. I thought the human race would have won out, Fessenden said interestedly. Apparently, they didn't have the adaptability of the reptilian race. I cried. That little human people would have lived for generations in peace and happiness if you hadn't brought that other world into contact with their own. Why didn't you let them alone? He said impatiently. Don't be a fool, Bradley. This is just a scientific experiment. Those ephemeral little races and their tiny worlds are merely a subject for study. And he added, Why, for days I've been observing and changing and tampering with these microcosmic worlds just to see the reactions of their peoples to different stimuli and dangers. I've learned things from them that you'd never dream. Watch, I'll show you others. In a stupefied trance I watched as Fessenden went on, taking my vision to world after world, prodding and changing, observing the fall of empires and the crash of planets with keen, amused detachment. I saw worlds of beauty incredible and worlds of horror unthinkable, planet after planet, race after race, and all of them merely the playthings of the experimenting scientist beside me. Fessenden showed me a planet in the microcosm that was covered with wild forest, in which dwelt little communities of hunting folk who chased the beasts of the forest. Generation after generation flashed by without change in their rude society. They were content to hunt and eat and love and die, without developing any higher civilization. Then Fessenden turned upon that little world a tiny ray that altered its chemical stability. Beneath the influence of chemical changes, the plant life of that world began to unfold in weird hypertrophy, began to develop mobility, to change into great rootless plant things that soon fell upon and killed the animals. The communities of hunters battled valiantly for a few generations against the moving plant hordes, But in the end they all succumbed, and that world was covered only with restlessly moving plant life. And Fessenden brought into our observation another world, planet of a sun out near the microcosm's edge. It was a watery world, covered with oceans over all of its surface, and teeming life had developed in that planetary sea into intelligent, seal-like people who had reared in the sea great submarine cities whose spires lifted here and there above the waters. Fessenden's filaments of force played upon that world, and the seas began to dwindle, the water molecules to fly off into space. And as the seas rapidly shrank, for generation after generation, more and more of that world became dry land, and the seal people had to desert many of their cities and retreat back with the waters. Very soon, as we watched, there was but one shallow sea remaining on that little world, and here were crowded the last of the seal folk, and here they fought blindly with all manner of scientific devices to prevent the evaporation of this last refuge. But the remorseless process that Fessenden had started went on, and that last sea dried and disappeared also, and there was only a desert planet with the ruined wrecks of the dead seal folk's city standing here and there as memorials of the vanished race. World after world my dazed eyes watched. I saw an icy planet that swung far out from its parent sun, and upon which was strange life adapted to the cold, bloodless little folk who had reared also a mighty civilization. Their weird palaces and cities rose amid the awful chasms of eternal ice, and it was evident that they were far advanced in scientific power. Fessenden reached and touched their sun with a tiny thread of force, and that sun blazed suddenly hotter and brighter, casting forth a quadrupled radiance. Its increased heat began to melt the ice sheath of that far-swinging little world, and its people began to perish from the unaccustomed warmth. We saw them frantically laboring for the next generation at a great work upon the site of their little world. Then its purpose became clear to us, for from that spot there projected a plume of fire and force, whose rocket-like push moved their little planet suddenly outward. They were moving their world farther from their sun to escape the increased warmth, and at a suitable distance they let it settle into a new orbit, where it was as cold as before, and Fessenden laughed and applauded their ingenuity. And there was a world whose crowded peoples were ruled by an oligarchy of living brains. Time after time, each generation that passed, we saw the enslaved people revolt against the tyranny of the brains, and each time the weapons of their unhuman masters subdued them. Fessenden's probing threads of force reached deep into the bowels of that little planet, and it rocked with terrific quakes that threw up vast masses of radioactive material from the interior, and a strange, glowing plague seized the bodies of the people and also seized the brains, so that they began to rot and die. Swiftly the people were annihilated by that glowing rot, but the brains managed to contrive for themselves an antidote against the deadly infections, so that most of the brains survived. For a few generations, the brains clung to existence, served now by machines of their own devising. But they must have made their mechanical servants too intelligent, for in time the machines rose against the brains and destroyed them. And later still, without any directing intelligence, the machines themselves came to wreck and vanished from that world. Dazed with horror, I watched as we viewed world after world of the microcosm, as Fessenden probed and changed and destroyed. And then there came into my view a world whose aching beauty brought tears to my eyes, a green and blossoming world whose people were human, but of a fineness and beauty far beyond our own humanity. Not upon their world were any towering cities or huge machines or swarming vehicles. Their civilization had reached a plane above crude material progress, and their planet was like a green and surpassingly lovely park. Here and there, amid the flowering trees, shimmered exquisite buildings, and through flowers and forests went white-robed noblemen and beautiful women, and their knowledge had almost conquered death, since for many microcosmic generations they remained unchanged. I watched that world through the telescope with my heart struck at the vision, and in the peace and loveliness of that planet and its people I seemed to catch a glimpse of what humanity might aspire to in some unthinkably far future. And then I suddenly woke to the fact that Fessenden, beside me, was reaching again toward the needle-like instrument that loosed his tampering forces upon the microcosmic worlds. I broke then from my trance and cried out horrified, "Fessenden, you can't do anything to endanger that world." He smiled sardonically. "Of course I'm going to do something. I want to see whether that people have not become decadent in their peace and plenty, whether the science that brought them up to that level can save them now, when real danger threatens." He chuckled as he sighted the needle-like thing. "A mere tiny thread of force, but it will cause their little sun to spin so fast that it will break up. Will that people have the resourcefulness to save themselves by flight to another sun? We shall soon see." But I tore him away from the deadly instrument and sent him staggering back across the laboratory with a wild thrust. "No," I cried. "These worlds and peoples that you experiment with and endanger and destroy, they're real as ours, even though infinitely smaller. I'll not let you calmly vivisect and torment any more of them out of your damnable scientific curiosity." Fessenden's black brows drew together in a cold fury, and he rasped, "I see now how foolish it was to show my experiment to an unreasoning sentimentalist like you. But that microcosm is my experiment, my property, and I'll experiment with and destroy every world in it if I please. Get away from that instrument." "I won't do it," I shouted. "You've wreaked horror enough on those tiny planets with your inhuman experiments, subjecting those little races to agony and toil and death just to gratify your unholy curiosity. You're not going to do it now with this little world." Fessenden sprang straight at me, rage burning in his black eyes. His heavy fist descended on me and knocked me away from the instrument I held. I reeled back from that blow, and at that moment I heard a hoarse cry. Fessenden had tripped on one of the cables in his wild spring, and was toppling into the space between the two disks. His toppling body struck the microcosm squarely, and it crashed around him in a broken shower of sparks. A universe wrecked in a second. At the same time, Fessenden's body exploded. It exploded into a bloated, torn thing of flesh, just as he had warned me any human body would do if it entered the area between the disks where there was no gravitation. The cable he had tripped over had jerked loose, and there was a flash of fire across the lower disk. In an instant, destroying blue electrical flames enveloped the disks and Fessenden's body, and danced around the electrical machinery in the laboratory with a sputtering, increasing roar. I turned and stumbled crazily out of the laboratory, out of the house into the wet and windy night. I heard a crackling roar behind me, and the flickering light of the now flaming house shot past me as I staggered on. But I did not look back. So ended Fessenden and his great experiment. No one doubted but that the eccentric scientist had somehow set fire to the house and had perished in the blaze, and I said nothing to change that opinion. And very soon his end was no longer remembered, and Fessenden is now forgotten by everyone except me. I wish that I could forget too, but I can't forget Fessenden and his microcosmic worlds, and because I can't, my soul is sick, and I have a shuddering, fearful wonder in me that will endure until I die, a black question to which I'll never get an answer, and which torments me every time I look up at the night stars. And the question that quakes in my soul whenever I look up into the starry sky, is this. Is our own great universe nothing but a tiny microcosm on some vaster scale? And in that vaster cosmos is there a super-experimenter who regards our universe as nothing but an interesting experiment, and who smites us with disasters just to study our reactions for his own amusement? Is there a Fessenden up there? The House of Living Music. If I had only killed Harriman on that first night. Yes, I know it would have been murder, but the diabolical thing that Harriman did was worse than any murder. He was a great composer. The world will never know just how great. He was also a devil from hell. But at that time I, a young newspaper music critic, had only admiration for Harriman. He was considered one of the greatest living composers. His mechanical symphony, with its mad blend of street noises and riveters, had started a whole new school of music. Then he had upset the academies again with what he called mathematical music. He always seemed striving to achieve some impossible musical ideal that haunted his brain. That night I met him in the lobby of Carnegie Hall. Inside, the Philharmonic had just launched into the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth, and I was hurrying toward that exultant shout of strings when I bumped into Harriman going out. I muttered a hasty excuse, and then I suddenly recognized him and stopped. It was Harriman, all right. His tall, thin figure clad as usual in rusty black, his unruly, thick grey hair falling over his brilliant grey eyes and taut face. He looked like a genius, Harriman did. I exclaimed, "You're not leaving now, surely? Don't you want to hear the finale?" Harriman said, "Hello, Raymer." Then he made an impatient, disgusted movement with his hand toward the distant music. "No, I don't want to hear it. It's a confession, Beethoven's confession of his ultimate failure as a composer." His grey eyes were bitter and scornful now as we stood there, listening to the chorus's great song that blended with the tumultuous instruments in the conclusion of Beethoven's stupendous work. "Human voices," said Harriman bitterly. "That's what Beethoven came down to in the end. His attempts to create pure, perfect music, an admitted failure." "What do you mean by perfect music?" I demanded. Unconsciously, in my interest, I had fallen into step with Harriman, and we had strolled together out into the warm spring night. Harriman's thin hand gesticulated as he explained. "I mean music that perfectly expresses things in sound. Take a flower, for instance. A painter can reproduce that flower exactly for your eyes by his colors. A scientist can reproduce it exactly for your mind by his exact classifications and measurements. Why shouldn't a musician be able to reproduce the flower exactly for your ear in sound, in music?" "It's an odd theory," I commented. "Sounds like a sort of sublimated program music." "Program music, hell," snarled Harriman angrily. "You wait until I—" He shut up suddenly, and I could not get another word out of him that evening. I left him at his apartment building, but I found pretext to call on him during the next few days and endeavored to draw him out further about his oddly interesting theory. It was no use, for Harriman was not often there, and when he was, he refused to be pumped. Yet my time wasn't wasted, for in my first visit I discovered his daughter. Lena Harriman became a greater attraction for me there than her father's radical musical ideas. She was a small girl, with bright yellow hair, a tip-tilted nose, and blue eyes dancing with love of fun. I think I fell in love with laughing, gay little Lena from the first. Harriman was too preoccupied to notice, though what so absorbed him I did not know. At first. Lena told me, a few weeks after I'd first met her. "I can't understand it, Harold," she said perplexedly. "Father is going in for scientific research." I was amazed. A first-class composer like Harriman, dabbling in science? Why in the world should he? She shook her bright head, puzzled. "I can't guess. He will tell me nothing. But you know that he was a brilliant student of physics before he took up music, and for the last months he has spent all his time down at the laboratories of Manhattan University, experimenting. He says that it's only a hobby of his. Strange hobby for a man whose whole life interests seem to be music," I commented, and I resolved to ask Harriman about it the next time I called. Well, I didn't ask him, for the next time I visited the apartment, Harriman was gone. So was Lena. The apartment was empty, and I learned from the building superintendent that the two had moved out only 2 days before. He didn't know where they had gone. Neither could I find any forwarding address through the post office. Harriman's music publishers were similarly ignorant. They didn't know the composer had left town until I told them. I was surprised and a little hurt, for I had thought that Lena and I were coming to an understanding, and couldn't comprehend why she would leave like that without a word. I thought, though, that she'd soon write from wherever they had gone, but the weeks went by and she didn't. She and her father had simply disappeared, as though the earth had swallowed them. I scoured around New York musical circles a good bit, without ever finding a clue to their whereabouts. As a final resort, I tried Manhattan University, in whose physical laboratories Harriman had been dabbling with research. The professor of physics there, a spectacled, white-haired Teuton, remembered Harriman quite well. "He was my pupil years ago. I expected him to become a brilliant physicist," he told me. Then he disappointed me. He turned to music. "A fine scientist wasted, just like that." He added, "He came back here a few months ago and asked to use my laboratories for some private research. Of course, I let him." "You don't know what kind of research?" I asked, a little curiously. The scientist shook his head. No, he was quite secretive. It seemed that he was conducting some experiments in acoustics, but I could not gather their nature. "And you've no idea where he and his daughter could have gone?" He hadn't. I thanked him and left, disappointed and wondering if Harriman had not become a little queer mentally. It certainly looked like it, for a composer of his reputation, a man of his devotion to music, to fling himself suddenly into abstruse scientific research for weeks and then abruptly disappear. I told myself, too, that if Lena had wanted me to know where she was, she would have written me. She hadn't, so I might as well forget her. But it wasn't so easy for me to forget laughing little Lena. Only now that she was gone did I discover how much I'd come to care for her. The withdrawal of her lilting, sunny being from my life left it flat and tasteless, and I followed my routine around the concert halls and operas of New York without much enthusiasm in the following months. During all those months I had not one word from Lena or her father, and never heard from anyone in musical circles any news of Harriman's whereabouts. He and Lena might just have dropped out of existence. Then, a full year after their disappearance, I was astounded to receive a telegram from Harriman. It had been sent from a village in western Massachusetts, and I read and reread it. "Raymer, I'm not dead, as you may have thought. I've been working up here, and I've achieved my ideal of perfect music. If you will come up here, you shall hear it. Lena." That was all I thought of when I read Harriman's queer message. I didn't care at that moment what Harriman had been doing in music. I was only overjoyed to discover at last where he and Lena were living. Early the next morning, I was in my roadster on the highway north, and as I drove through the spring-green Berkshires that afternoon, I could hardly wait to reach Lena. I still couldn't understand why she had not written me, but told myself that doubtless her father had forbidden it in his desire for seclusion. The village from which his wire had come was a neat little community of white frame houses, tucked in the big hills west of Greenfield. There, I learned without trouble where Harriman was living, a hilltop house a few miles out of the village. It was late afternoon by the time I steered my car around a winding dirt road into sight of the place. Harriman's house stood brooding black against the red embers of sunset, up on the low, domed hill. It was an old stone colonial farmhouse, whose grounds looked shabby and ill cared for. I stopped my car in its drive, wondering whether gay, fun-loving Lena had liked this isolated place. My heart pounded with eager anticipation as I stood in the dusk on the veranda, ringing the bell. But when the door opened, my spirits were a little dashed, for it wasn't Lena who stood inside, but Harriman himself. He had changed in this year. His white face was thinner, looking more taut and strained than it had been, and his grey eyes, always brilliant, were burning now with some continuous inward excitement. He smiled at me a little oddly, and said, "I hoped you'd come, Raymer. I was almost sure you would." "Where's Lena?" I demanded eagerly. "Does she know I'm coming?" Harriman made a brusque gesture. "Oh, Lena. She's not here." "Not here?" I echoed, dismayed. He shook his head. "No, she couldn't stand the loneliness out here. A month after we came, she left me and went down to live with an aunt of hers in North Carolina." He added, "Come on in, Raymer. Let me have your bag." I was numb with disappointment as I followed him inside. Only now was I aware how eagerly I had looked forward to seeing Lena again. Harriman, however, appeared not to notice my dejection, as he conducted me into the living room of the old house. The room was in an unforgivably slovenly state from complete lack of care, dust lying thick on the floor and old-fashioned black furniture. It was quite evident that Harriman was living here alone. He was rigid with repressed excitement as he told me now, "Raymer, you'll thank heaven you came here, for you, first of all men, are going to hear the greatest music ever produced on this earth. My music." I said hesitatingly. "Yes, but Lena. I can't understand why she never wrote me from Carolina." He exclaimed impatiently. "Oh, forget about Lena. Haven't you any curiosity at all about my music?" I tried to summon up an appearance of interest. "Of course I'm curious, Harriman. What have you been composing up here anyway? Another symphony?" He nodded slowly, his brilliant grey eyes fixed with an odd expression on mine. "You might call it that. You remember, Raymer, that I once told you my dream was to create music that would perfectly express anything, any object, in sound? Well, I've succeeded, and you're going to hear that music. Come along to my laboratory." "Your laboratory?" I repeated, surprised. He chuckled. "Yes, Raymer. This music isn't composed with pen and ruled paper. It is created by— But come on, and see for yourself." I followed him along a dark corridor that led into the rear portion of the rambling old house. He led into a dark room, and when he had snapped on the lights, I saw that it really did look like a scientific laboratory. There were various electrical generators and machines around the room, which meant nothing to a music critic like myself. There was also a sound recording machine and a large phonograph, but the central object in the room was a big cubical metal chamber 6 feet high. This weird apparatus was open in front, and fastened outside one of its sides was a bank of big vacuum tubes connected to a resonator, like a flat loudspeaker. I said, "This is a queer kind of study for a composer." Harriman laughed triumphantly. "Wait until you hear the music that has been created in this room." He opened a big steel filing case. I saw that it was full of black discs, phonograph records of the long-playing kind. They were not ordinary commercial records, though, for the only label on each one was a white sticker with a scrawled word in Harriman's writing. Harriman took out one of the records and placed it on the turntable of the large phonograph near me. Then he turned to me. "This is one of the first pieces of music I created here, Raymer. It is a series of flowers in music." I said doubtfully. You mean a descriptive suite, something like Hadley's? Hadley be damned, he muttered. This isn't a musical description of flowers. It's the flowers themselves in music. Listen. He started the phonograph. Out from the turning black disc welled music. Strange music, such as I had never heard before. Its notes did not seem to have been produced by any musical instrument known to man. They were purer, sweeter, clearer than any sounds that man-made instruments could create. And they wove a weird magic pattern of changing sound in the lamp-lit laboratory, music that brought with it to my ears and brain inevitable sound pictures of the blossoming plants of Earth. Each separate, drifting melodic phrase seemed to conjure up for me a different impression of flowers blooming from the soil. There were shy, sweet, fluted melodies, fugitive and brief, that brought to my mind the wild nodding violets and daisies. There were thrilling, full-voiced harmonies of gorgeous roses, cool, low songs of drooping orchids, flaring music of vivid poppy and hibiscus, sighing whisper of white lilies beside forest pools, and gay, climbing clarinet-like notes that irresistibly suggested the waving cattails. I listened enthralled, almost forgetting my disappointment over Lena's absence. It was like hearing all the flowers of Earth instead of seeing them. As he played record after record, the cool drifting music brought before my eyes everything that has root and seed and flower, all the life that climbs upward from the soil into the sunlight. Harriman, it's wonderful, I cried. It is music like no other ever composed before. But I can't understand on what instruments you produced it. You will soon learn that, Harriman answered, his thin face smiling strangely. There is more that I want you to hear first. One record after another he brought from the cabinet and played. Enchanted, I listened, hearing music such as surely no one had ever listened to before. Music perfectly expressive of the life of Earth. Strong, vibrating harmonies as of the hushed reed instruments that voice the trees of the forest, the sturdy young elms and gnarled oaks and slender, graceful birches. Deep, solemn chords like the muttering of ancient bassoons, expressing in sound the rocks of Earth itself, the eternal quartz and granite, ringing, crystal bell notes of shining forest spring and stream. And the wild, moving life of Earth welled out in the room in music too, swift, thrilling harmonies of the winged birds that dart in the sky, nervous, quick tumbling music of the squirrels running in the branches, little orderly rhythms of tiny pattering brasses in complex counterpoint that voice the intricate life of hive and ant-hill, long, suave harmonies that brought before the eyes the silver fish poised in his dim, curving world. All the inanimate earth, and also its animate plant and animal life, poured forth in torrents of weird music. Harriman finally stopped the phonograph, his eyes brilliant with triumph. Now do you know what perfect music is, Raymer? I cried. How in the world did you do it? How could you create music like that? It's as though you translated the rocks and birds and flowers themselves into music. That, said Harriman, is just what I do. I stared at him. What do you mean? Just what I said, he replied calmly. Watch, Raymer. He went to the big, cube-shaped apparatus and touched certain switches on its control panel. The electrical mechanisms around the room broke into whining life. A flood of white radiance cascaded down from the top of the cube's interior, filling the hollow chamber with shining force. The great vacuum on the side began to sputter. Harriman took a red carnation from a vase of flowers and tossed the blossom into the force-filled chamber. Then my eyes beheld an uncanny thing. The carnation began to fade, to disappear slowly, as though under that terrific flood of white force its The very substance was melting away. And from the resonator outside the cubical chamber at the same time began to issue sounds. Music. Hushed, velvety, slow-climbing tones in languid rhythm. A smooth, slow harmony that perfectly expressed in sound the fading flower inside the cube. The flower faded further, became almost invisible in its increasing tenuity. The velvety music from the resonator swelled louder. Then, as I watched frozenly, the carnation in the cube vanished altogether, and the music ended. I gasped, "Good Lord, it isn't possible that I've seen—" Harriman nodded quietly. "Yes, Raymer, you've just seen solid matter transmuted into sound, a flower translated into music. I can do the same with any living or non-living matter." And, to show me, he took a living rabbit from a cage in the corner and tossed it also into the force-filled chamber. I saw the furry little animal freeze motionless inside, as though petrified by the white force. It too began slowly to fade, and again from the resonator came music. Different music. Darting, quick little runs of jovial, silvery notes in broken rhythm. A complex harmony that was a perfect sound picture of the furtive little thing inside the tube. The rabbit faded further. The music swelled quicker and louder. Then the little beast too had vanished, and with a last flutter of silver notes, the music ended. I said hoarsely, "A flower, an animal, converted into pure sound." Harriman nodded again. "Just so was created all the music which you have heard, and which I have recorded as it issued from that apparatus. Everything I put into that cube beneath the changing force, flower, or rock, or bird, or beast, has been transmuted into pure music, which I have preserved on these records." "But how?" I cried, stupefied. "The thing's not possible." Harriman's eyes glistened. "Yet I achieved it, Raymer. Achieved my life ambition of creating music that does not describe a thing, but is that thing turned into sound. It's simple enough, in principle. What is music? Sound. A vibration in the air, is it not? And what is matter? A vibration in the ether, nothing more. Well, find a way to transfer that vibration from the ether to the air, and you have transmuted matter into sound, into music. That process does not offer great difficulties. After all, any ordinary radio can transfer etheric vibrations, the Hertzian waves which flash through the ether, into sound vibrations. It is very little harder to convert the different etheric vibrations which are matter into sound waves. This apparatus of mine does it easily. The more complex the matter, the more complex will be the sound, the music. Harriman's face was gleaming with rapt devotion as he continued, "By this method, I'm going to create the greatest symphony that will ever be heard. An Earth symphony, containing the pure music of Earth itself, its rocks and streams and flowers and birds and beasts. Out of the pure music preserved in these records, I shall assemble that Earth symphony, the greatest musical work that will ever be heard in this world." Stunned, I said, "But somehow this whole business seems unholy, uncanny." I asked with a sudden thought, "Is that why Lena left here? Because of this weird work of creation of yours?" Harriman nodded impatiently. "Yes, Lena too thought that it was uncanny and didn't want to stay. I've been living here quite alone, and that's why I wired you to come, Raymer. I wanted someone to know what I have achieved." The brooding brilliance in his eyes deepened. "But my great work here is nearly completed now. Soon I shall have arranged and assembled the pure music of these records into my Earth Symphony. When the world hears the records of that symphony, it will hear pure, perfect music for the first time." He broke off, turning to me. "You look pretty dazed, Raymer, and tired too. We'll have some supper, and after a good night's sleep, you'll be better able to appreciate what I'm doing." I made no objection, but I ate little of the sketchy supper which Harriman prepared in the ill-kept kitchen. I was still extremely disappointed by Lena's absence, yet I could well understand now why she had left. There was something so strange about Harriman's fantastically created music that it repelled me in spite of its perfect beauty. Later, as I lay in bed in the dark, musty chamber Harriman had assigned me, I found myself shivering a little when I heard faint, drifting music from his library. He was there, I knew, even this late, going over his records, listening to the music into which he had converted life itself. Through the dark house the weird music whispered to me, where I lay in darkness. I heard again those cool, sweet harmonies of forest flowers, those mighty chords of the eternal rocks, the swift, rippling rhythms of winged birds and jovial broken music of furtive forest beasts. The music stopped, and then it began again. But this time it was not any music that Harriman had played for me in the laboratory, but was new, different music that brought me bolt upright in bed, trembling as I listened. A gay, dancing melody it was now, clearer and sweeter and more tender than any he had let me hear. It rose and fell like love and laughter themselves, translated into silver sound. Sweeter, stronger swelled that silver melody, while I listened with a strange feeling clutching my heart. That exquisite, lilting music, it was like the laughing tenderness of a loving heart, like a bright-haired girl dancing in the sunlight, like Lena. That hideous thought crashed into my brain like a dissonance of horror across the lilting notes. I leaped wildly out of bed, snatched on my clothes, and crept down the corridor toward the laboratory door. I was trembling like a harp string as I paused outside that door. From within, the gay, sweet music welled to a sheer climax of unearthly melody. Her last phrase of exquisitely tender notes whispered to me, then silence. I crashed madly through the door. Harriman whirled from the big phonograph, his face a stiff white mask of alarm, and came toward me. I thrust him reeling aside and ran to the phonograph, peered with wild eyes at the black record that lay on it. The label on the disc bore a single written word, Lena. Lena! I screamed it aloud like a maniac at Harriman as he stumbled to his feet. You did the thing to her, too! Translated her into music! Yes, I did. Harriman's stiff white face was strange, and in his voice there was a ghastly note of unhuman pride. He had drawn a pistol from his pocket and was covering me with it. His voice swelled, his eyes blazed. Yes, I put Lena into the cube and transmuted her also into music, music that will live forever. I loved her, do you hear? Yet I did not hesitate to do that, for as a mere human being of flesh and blood she would have died within a few score of years. But as music, imprisoned eternally in that record, she is undying in beauty. She will live on always as part of my immortal Earth Symphony. And you too will be part of that great symphony, Raymer. That is the reason why I had you come here. For my Earth Symphony, to be really complete, must have in it not only the rocks and streams, the birds and flowers and beasts, it must also have in it human life, human love, man and woman who love each other. The music that was Lena is already recorded and preserved, and you, Raymer, shall now become music likewise, and take your place with her in my symphony. And Harriman, keeping his pistol aimed at my heart, strode toward the control panel of his diabolical apparatus. The switches clicked. The white forces streamed down into the interior of the tube. He rasped, "You will step into the cube, Raymer. Otherwise—" He stopped, for by now the wild grief that had frozen me suddenly dissolved into mad rage as I stared at the black record in which was prisoned the music that had been the girl I loved. Gone, transmuted into silver melody, lost to me forever. Lena. I shrieked. By heaven, your devil's symphony will never be heard by the world. I'll destroy it and you. And in my crazy rage I leaped at the filing case and tore out the neat stacks of black records, sent them crashing to the floor in showers of broken black bits. Harriman shrieked and shot. I felt the bullets tear into my shoulder, but in my mad wrath I did not even experience any pain. And as I tore out the last records and smashed them, Harriman leaped at me. His eyes blazed awful agony, and his hands clutched my throat to choke me. He too had gone mad at sight of the destruction of his work. We wrestled there, two crazily struggling men in the lamp-lit laboratory. Lena! I kept shouting as I struggled, that strangling horror still utterly possessing my soul. I tore his hands from my throat, forced him back across the room, toward the devilish cube inside which the white transmuting forces flamed. I thrust him with a wild push inside the cube. Harriman's thin body froze rigid in there beneath the terrific forces. Pain, awful pain, leaped into his stricken eyes. His petrified body began to waver, to fade, and as he faded, sound, music, swelled out from the resonator at the side of the cube, music into which Harriman's mind and body were being translated, thunderous, crashing chords of vaulting and collapsing superhuman aspirations, mad bellowing as of brasses trumpeting soaring ambitions that had failed. Wild music such as no man had ever heard before, thundering on my ears, as Harriman's frozen body faded and faded, until at last his misty form was gone, and with a last long wail of bitter agony, the music had ended. I was only dimly conscious, but I reeled forward, and with great blows smashed the tubes and apparatus of the cube, then staggered to the phonograph and snatched from it the black record with Lena's name upon it, the only one that had escaped destruction. And with it clutched to my breast, I stumbled blindly and drunkenly out of that house, accursed. The world never knew what became of Harriman and Lena. When I drove unsteadily into the village in the grey dawn after that hideous night, I told only that I had found them missing from the old house. The signs of destruction in the house led local authorities to believe that intruders bent on robbery had killed Harriman and his daughter and disposed of their bodies. I let them think so, for I knew that if I told the truth they would deem me mad. I am no longer a music critic, for I can no longer bear to hear music of any sort. But there is one exception. That is the record that I took with me from Harriman's house, the black disc that imprisons forever the tender, wonderful melody into which was transmuted the girl I loved. That music I hear each night. I start that record playing, and as the dancing melody swells out, gay and clear and sweet, Lena is again beside me in the dark room. Little Lena, laughing beside me in the lilting, exquisite music that was her being. She will be with me thus while I live. The Seeds from Outside. Standifer found the seeds the morning after the meteor fell on the hill above his cottage. On that night he had been sitting in the scented darkness of his little garden when he had glimpsed the vertical flash of light and heard the whiz and crash of that falling visitor from outer space. And all that night he had lain awake, eager for morning, and the chance to find and examine the meteor. Standifer knew little of meteors, for he was not a scientist. He was a painter, whose canvases hung in many impressive halls in great cities, and were appropriately admired and denounced and gabbled about by those who liked such things. Standifer had grown weary of such people and of their cities, and had come to this lonely little cottage in the hills to paint and dream. For it was not cities or people that Standifer wished to paint, but the green growing life of earth that he loved so deeply. There was no growing thing in wood or field that he did not know. The slim white sycamores that whispered together along the streams, and the sturdy little sumacs that were like small, jovial plant gnomes, and the innocent wild roses that bloomed and swiftly died in their shady cover. He had toiled to transfix and preserve their subtle beauty forever in his oils and colours and cloths. The spring had murmured by in a drifting dream, as Standifer had lived and worked alone. And now suddenly into the hushed quiet of his green blossoming world had rudely crashed this visitant from distant realms. It strangely stirred Standifer's imagination, so that through the night he lay wondering and gazing up through his casement at the white stars from which the meteor had come. It was hardly dawn, and a chill and drenching dew silvered the grass and bent the poplar leaves, when Standifer excitedly climbed the hill in search of the meteor. The thing was not hard to find. It had smashed savagely into the spring-green woods, and had torn a great raw gouge out of the earth as it had crashed and shattered. For the meteor had shattered into chunks of jagged, dark metal that lay all about that new gaping hole. Those ragged lumps were still faintly warm to the touch, and Standifer went from one to another, turning them over and examining them with marvelling curiosity. It was when he was about to leave the place that he glimpsed amid this meteoric debris the little square tan case. It lay half embedded still in one of the jagged metal chunks. The case was no more than 2 inches square, and was made of some kind of stiff tan fibre that was very tough, and apparently impervious to heat. It was quite evident that the case had been inside the heart of the shattered meteor, and that it was the product of intelligence. Standifer was vastly excited. He dug the tiny case out of the meteoric fragment, and then tried to tear it open, but neither his fingers nor sharp stones could make any impression on the tough fibre. So he hurried back down to his cottage with the case clutched in his hand, his head suddenly filled with ideas of messages sent from other worlds or stars. But at the cottage he was amazed to find that neither steel knives nor drills nor chisels could make the slightest impression upon this astounding material. It seemed to the eye to be just stiff tan fibre, yet he knew that it was a far different kind of material, as refractory as diamond, and as flexibly tough as steel. It was several hours before he thought of pouring water upon the enigmatic little container. When he did so, the fibre-like stuff instantly softened. It was evident that the material had been designed to withstand the tremendous heat and shock of alighting on another world, but to soften up and open when it fell upon a moist, warm world. Standifer carefully cut open the softened case. Then he stared, puzzled, at its contents, a frown upon his sensitive face. There was nothing inside the case but 2 withered-looking brown seeds, each of them about an inch long. He was disappointed at first. He had expected writing of some kind, perhaps even a tiny model or machine. But after a while his interest rose again, for it occurred to him that these could be no ordinary seeds which the people of some far planet had tried to sow broadcast upon other worlds. So he planted the 2 seeds in a carefully weeded corner of his flower garden, about 10 feet apart, and in the days that followed he scrupulously watered and watched them, and waited eagerly to see what kind of strange plants might spring from them. His interest was so great indeed that he forgot all about his unfinished canvases, the work that had brought him to the seclusion of these quiet hills. Yet he did not tell anyone of his strange find, for he felt that if he did, excited scientists would come and take the seeds away to study and dissect, and he did not want that. In 2 weeks, he was vastly excited to see the first little shoots of dark green come up through the soil at the places where he had planted the 2 seeds. They were like stiff little green rods, and they did not look very unusual to Standifer. Yet he continued to water them carefully and to wait tensely for their development. The 2 shoots came up fast after that. Within a month, they had become green pillars almost 6 feet tall, each of them covered with a tight-wrapped sheath of green sepals. They were a little thicker at the middle than at the top or bottom, and one of them was a little slenderer than the other, and its color a lighter green. Altogether, they looked like no plants ever before seen on Earth. Standifer saw that the sheathing sepals were now beginning to unfold, to curl back from the tops of the plants. He waited, almost breathlessly, for their further development, and every night before he retired he looked last at the plants, and every morning when he awoke they were his first thought. Then, early one June morning, he found that the sepals had curled back enough from the tips to let him see the tops of the true plants inside, and he stood for many minutes there, staring in strange wonder at that which the unfolding of the sepals was beginning to reveal. For where they had curled back at the tips, they disclosed what looked strangely like the tops of 2 human heads. It was as though 2 people were enclosed in those sheathing sepals, 2 people the hair of whose heads was becoming visible as masses of fine green threads, more animal than plant in appearance. One looked very much like the top of a girl's head, a mass of fluffy, light green hair, only the upper part of which was visible. The other head was of shorter, coarser, and darker green hair, as though it was that of a man. Standifer went through that day in a stupefied daze. He was almost tempted to unfold the sepals further by force, so intense was his curiosity, but he restrained himself and waited, and the next few days brought him further confirmation of his astounding suspicion. The sepals of both plants had by then unfolded almost completely, and inside one was a green man-plant, and in the other a girl. Their bodies were strangely human in shape, living, breathing bodies of weird, soft, green plant flesh, with tendril-like arms and tendril limbs, too, that were still rooted and hidden down in the calyxes. Their heads and faces were very human indeed, with green pupilled eyes through which they could see. Standifer stared and stared at the plant girl, for she was beautiful beyond the artist's dreams, her slim green body rising proudly straight from the cup of her calyx. Her shining, green-pupilled eyes saw him as he stood by her, and she raised a tendril-like arm and softly touched him, and her tendrils stirred with a soft rustling that was like a voice speaking to him. Then Standifer heard a deeper, angry rustling behind him, and turned. It was the man-plant, his big tendril arms reaching furiously to grasp the artist, jealousy and rage in his eyes. Hastily, the painter stepped away from him. In the days that followed, Standifer was like one living in a dream, for he had fallen in love with the shining, slim plant girl, and he spent almost all his waking hours sitting in his garden looking into her eyes, listening to the strange rustling that was her speech. It seemed to his artist's soul that the beauty of no animal-descended earthwoman could match the slender grace of this plant girl. He would stand beside her and wish passionately that he could understand her rustling whisper as her tendrils softly touched and caressed him. The man-plant hated him, he knew, and would try to strike at him. And the man hated the girl, too, in time. He would reach raging tendrils out toward her to clutch her, but was too far separated from her ever to reach her. Stander foresaw that these two strange creatures were still developing, and that their feet would soon come free of their roots. He knew that these were beings of a kind of life utterly unlike anything terrestrial, that they began their life cycle as seeds and rooted plants, and that they developed then into free and moving plant people, such as were unknown on this world. He knew, too, that on whatever far world was their home, creatures like these must have reached a great degree of civilization and science to send out broadcast into space the seeds that would sow their race upon other planets. But of their distant origin he thought little, as he waited impatiently for the day when his shining plant girl would be free of her roots. He felt that that day was very near, and he did not like to leave the garden even for a minute now. But on one morning, Standifer had to leave to go to the village for necessary supplies, since for 2 days there had been no food in the cottage, and he felt himself growing weak with hunger. It hurt him to part from the plant girl, even for those few hours, and he stood for minutes caressing her fluffy green hair and listening to her happy rustling before he took himself off. When he returned, he heard as soon as he entered his garden a sound that chilled the blood in his veins. It was the plant girl's voice, a mere agonized whisper that spoke dreadful things. He rushed wildly into the garden and stood a moment aghast at what he saw. The final development had taken place in his absence. Both creatures had come free of their roots, and the man-plant had, in his jealousy and hate, broken and torn the shining green body of the girl. She lay, her tendrils stirring feebly, while the other looked down at her in satisfied hate. Standifer madly seized a scythe and ran across the garden. In 2 terrific strokes, he cut down the man-plant into a dead thing oozing dark green blood. Then he dropped the weapon and wildly stooped over his dying plant girl. She looked up at him through pain-filled, wide eyes as her life oozed away. A green, tendril arm lifted slowly to touch his face, and he heard a last rustling whisper from this creature whom he had loved, and who had loved him across the vast gulf of world-differing species. Then he knew that she was dead. That was long ago, and the garden by the little cottage is weed-grown now, and holds no memory of those 2 strange creatures from the great outside who grew and lived and died there. Standifer does not dwell there any more, but lives far away in the burning, barren Arizona desert, for never since then can he bear the sight of green, growing things. What's it like out there? 1. I hadn't wanted to wear my uniform when I left the hospital, but I didn't have any other clothes there, and I was too glad to get out to argue about it. But as soon as I got on the local plane I was taking to Los Angeles, I was sorry I had it on. People gawked at me and began to whisper. The stewardess gave me a special big smile. She must have spoken to the pilot, for he came back and shook hands and said, "Well, I guess a trip like this is sort of a come-down for you." A little man came in, looked around for a seat and took the one beside me. He was a fussy, spectacled guy of 50 or 60, and he took a few minutes to get settled. Then he looked at me and stared at my uniform and at the little brass button on it that said 2. "Why," he said, "you're one of those Expedition 2 men." And then, as though he'd only just figured it out, "Why, you've been to Mars." "Yeah," I said. "I was there." He beamed at me in a kind of wonder. I didn't like it, but his curiosity was so friendly that I couldn't quite resent it. "Tell me," he said, "what's it like out there?" The plane was lifting, and I looked out at the Arizona desert sliding by close underneath. "Different," I said. "It's different." The answer seemed to satisfy him completely. "I'll just bet it is," he said. "Are you going home, Mr. Haddon? Sergeant Frank Haddon." "You going home, Sergeant?" "My home's back in Ohio," I told him. "I'm going into L.A. to look up some people before I go home." "Well, that's fine. I hope you have a good time, Sergeant. You deserve it. You boys did a great job out there. Why, I read in the newspapers that after the UN sends out a couple more expeditions, we'll have cities out there and regular passenger lines and all that." "Look," I said, "that stuff is for the birds. You might as well build cities down here in Mojave and have them a lot closer. There's only one reason for going to Mars now, and that's uranium." I could see he didn't quite believe me. "Oh, sure," he said. "I know that's important too, the uranium we're all using now for our power stations, but that isn't all, is it?" "It'll be all for a long, long time," I said. "But look, Sergeant, this newspaper article said—" I didn't say anything more. By the time he'd finished telling about the newspaper article, we were coming down into L.A. He pumped my hand when we got out of the plane. "Have yourself a time, Sergeant. You sure rate it. I hear a lot of chaps on 2 didn't come back." "Yeah," I said. "I heard that." I was feeling shaky again by the time I got to downtown L.A. I went in a bar and had a double bourbon, and it made me feel a little better. I went out and found a cabbie and asked him to drive me out to San Gabriel. He was a fat man with a broad red face. "Hop right in, buddy," he said. "Say, you're one of those Mars guys, aren't you?" I said, "That's right." "Well, well," he said. "Tell me, how was it out there?" "It was a pretty dull grind, in a way," I told him. "I'll bet it was," he said, as we started through traffic. I was in the army in World War II, 20 years ago. That's just what it was, a dull grind 9/10 of the time. I guess it hasn't changed any." "This wasn't any army expedition," I explained. "It was a United Nations one, not an army one. But we had officers and rules of discipline like the army." "Sure, it's the same thing," said the cabbie. "You don't need to tell me what it's like, buddy. Why, back there in 42, or was it 43? Anyway, back there I remember that—" I leaned back and watched Huntington Boulevard slide past. The sun poured in on me and seemed very hot, and the air seemed very thick and soupy. It hadn't been so bad up on the Arizona plateau, but it was a little hard to breathe down here. The cabbie wanted to know what address in San Gabriel. I got the little packet of letters out of my pocket and found the one that had Martin Valinez and a street address on the back. I told the cabbie and put the letters back into my pocket. I wish now that I'd never answered them. But how could I keep from answering when Joe Valinez's parents wrote to me at the hospital? And it was the same with Jim's girl and Walter's family. I'd had to write back. And the first thing I knew, I'd promised to come and see them, and now if I went back to Ohio without doing it, I'd feel like a heel. Right now, I wished I'd decided to be a heel. The address was on the south side of San Gabriel, in a section that still had a faintly Mexican tinge to it. There was a little frame grocery store with a small house beside it, and a picket fence around the yard of the house. Very neat, but a queerly homely place after all the slick California stucco. I went into the little grocery and a tall, dark man with quiet eyes took a look at me and called a woman's name in a low voice, and then came around the counter and took my hand. "You're Sergeant Haddon," he said. "Yes, of course. We've been hoping you'd come." His wife came in a hurry from the back. She looked a little too old to be Joe's mother, for Joe had been just a kid. But then she didn't look so old either, but just sort of worn. She said to Valines, "Please, a chair. Can't you see he's tired, and just from the hospital?" I sat down and looked between them at a case of canned peppers, and they asked me how I felt, and wouldn't I be glad to get home, and they hoped all my family were well. They were gentlefolk. They hadn't said a word about Joe, just waited for me to say something. And I felt in a spot, for I hadn't known Joe well, not really. He'd been moved into our squad only a couple of weeks before takeoff, and since he'd been our first casualty, I'd never got to know him much. I finally had to get it over with, and all I could think to say was, "They wrote you in detail about Joe, didn't they?" Valines nodded gravely. "Yes, that he died from shock within 24 hours after takeoff. The letter was very nice." His wife nodded too. "Very nice," she murmured. She looked at me, and I guess she saw that I didn't know quite what to say, for she said, "You can tell us more about it, yet you must not if it pains you." I could tell them more. Oh yes, I could tell them a lot more if I wanted to. It was all clear in my mind, like a movie film you run over and over, till you know it by heart. I could tell them all about the takeoff that had killed their son, the long lines of us, uniformed backs going up into Rocket 4 and all the other 19 rockets, the lights flaring up there on the plateau, the grind of machinery and blast of whistles, and the inside of the big rocket as we climbed up the ladders of its center well. The movie was running again in my mind, clear as crystal, and I was back in Cell 14 of Rocket 4, with the minutes ticking away and the walls quivering every time one of the other rockets blasted off, and us 10 men in our hammocks, prisoned inside that odd-shaped windowless metal room, waiting, till that big, giant hand came and smacked us down deep into our recoil springs, crushing the breath out of us, so that you fought to breathe, and the blood roared into your head, and your stomach heaved in spite of all the pills they'd given you, and you heard the giant laughing, "Baroom, baroom, baroom." Smash, smash, again and again, hitting us in the guts and cutting our breath, and someone being sick and someone else sobbing, and the baroom, baroom laughing as it killed us. And then the giant quit laughing, and quit slapping us down, and you could feel your sore and shaky body, and wonder if it was still all there. Walter Millis cursing a blue streak in the hammock underneath me, and Breck Jurgen, our sergeant then, clambering painfully out of his straps to look us over, and then through the voices a thin, ragged voice saying uncertainly, "Breck, I think I'm hurt." Sure, that was their boy Joe, and there was blood on his lips, and he'd had it. We knew when we first looked at him that he'd had it. A handsome kid, turned waxy now as he held his hand on his middle and looked up at us. Expedition 1 had proved that takeoff would hit a certain percentage with internal injuries every time. And in our squad, in our little windowless cell, it was Joe that had been hit. If only he'd died right off. But he couldn't die right off. He had to lie in the hammock all those hours and hours. The medics came and put a straitjacket around his body and doped him up. And that was that. And the hours went by. And we were so shaken and deathly sick ourselves that we didn't have the sympathy for him we should have had. Not till he started moaning and begging us to take the jacket off. Finally, Walter Millis wanted to do it, and Breck wouldn't allow it, and they were arguing, and we were listening when the moaning stopped, and there was no need to do anything about Joe Valines anymore. Nothing but to call the medics who came into our little iron prison and took him away. Sure, I could tell the Valaneses all about how their Joe died, couldn't I? "Please," whispered Mrs. Valanes, and her husband looked at me and nodded silently. So I told them. I said, "You know Joe died in space. He'd been knocked out by the shock of takeoff, and he was unconscious, not feeling a thing. And then he woke up before he died. He didn't seem to be feeling any pain, not a bit. He lay there, looking out the window at the stars. They're beautiful, the stars out there in space, like angels. He looked, and then he whispered something, and lay back, and was gone." Mrs. Valanes began to cry softly. To die out there, looking at stars like angels. I got up to go, and she didn't look up. I went out the door of the little grocery store, and Valanes came with me. He shook my hand. "Thank you, Sergeant Haddon. Thank you very much." "Sure," I said. I got into the cab. I took out my letters and tore that one into bits. I wished to God I'd never got it. I wished I didn't have any of the other letters I still had. 2. I took the early plane for Omaha. Before we got there, I fell asleep in my seat, and then I began to dream, and that wasn't good. A voice said, "We're coming down," and we were coming down. Rocket 4 was coming down, and there we were in our squad cell, all of us strapped into our hammocks, waiting and scared, wishing there was a window so we could see out, hoping our rocket wouldn't be the one to crack up, hoping none of the rockets cracked up. But if one does, don't let it be ours. We're coming down, with the blast starting to boom again underneath us, hitting us hard, not steady like a takeoff, but blast, 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 and then again blast, blast. Breck's voice calling to us from across the cell, but I couldn't hear for the roaring that was in my ears between blasts. No, it was not in my ears. That roaring came from the wall beside me. We had hit atmosphere. We were coming in. The blasts in lightning succession without stopping. Crash, 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 crash. Mountains fell on me, and this was it. And don't let it be ours. Please, God, don't let it be ours. Then the bump, and the blackness, and finally somebody yelling hoarsely in my ears, and Breck Jürgen, his face deathly white, leaning over me. "Unstrap and get out, Frank. All men out of hammocks. All men out." We'd landed, and we hadn't cracked up, but we were half dead, and they wanted us to turn out right this minute, and we couldn't. Breck yelling to us, "Breathing masks on, we've got to go out." "My God, we've just landed. We're torn to bits, we can't." "We've got to. Some of the other rockets cracked up in landing, and we've got to save whoever's still living in them. Masks on, hurry." We couldn't, but we did. They hadn't given us all those months of discipline for nothing. Jim Clymer was already on his feet. Walter was trying to unstrap underneath me. Whistles were blowing like mad somewhere, and voices shouted hoarsely. My knees wobbled under me as I hit the floor. Young Lassen beside me tried to say something, and then crumpled up. Jim bent over him, but Breck was at the door yelling, "Let him go! Come on!" The whistles screeching at us all the way down the ladders of the well, and the mask clip hurting my nose, and down at the bottom a dishevelled officer yelling at us to get out and join Squad 5, and the gangway reeling under us. Cold, freezing cold, and a wan sunshine from the shrunken little sun up there in the brassy sky, and a rolling plain of ochreous red sand stretching around us, sand that slid away under our feet as our squads followed Captain Wall toward the distant metal bulk that lay oddly canted and broken in a little shallow valley. "Come on, men! Hurry! Hurry!" Sure, all of it a dream. The dreamlike way we walked with our lead-soled shoes dragging our feet back after each step, and the voices coming through the mask resonators muffled and distant. Only not a dream, but a nightmare, when we got up to the canted metal bulk and saw what had happened to Rocket 7. The metal hull ripped like paper, and a few men crawling out of the wreck with blood on them, and a gurgling sound where shattered tanks were emptying, and voices whimpering, "First aid! First aid!" Only it hadn't happened. It hadn't happened yet at all, for we were still back in Rocket 4 coming in. We hadn't landed yet at all, but we were going to any minute. "We're coming down." I couldn't go through it all again. I yelled and fought my hammock straps and woke up, and I was in my plane seat, and a scared hostess was a foot away from me, saying, "This is Omaha, Sergeant. We're coming down." They were all looking at me, all the other passengers, and I guessed I'd been talking in the dream. I still had the sweat down my back like all those nights in the hospital when I'd keep waking up. I sat up, and they all looked away from me quick and pretended they hadn't been staring. We came down to the airport. It was midday, and the hot Nebraska sun felt good on my back when I got out. I was lucky, for when I asked at the bus depot about going to Cuffington, there was a bus all ready to roll. A farmer sat down beside me, a big young fellow who offered me cigarettes and told me it was only a few hours' ride to Cuffington. "Your home there?" he asked. "No, my home's back in Ohio," I said. "A friend of mine came from there, name of Clymer." He didn't know him, but he remembered that one of the town boys had gone on that second expedition to Mars. "Yeah," I said. "That was Jim." He couldn't keep it in any longer. "What's it like out there, anyway?" I said, "Dry. Terrible dry." "I'll bet it is," he said. "To tell the truth, it's too dry here this year, for good wheat weather. Last year it was fine. Last year—" Cuffington, Nebraska was a wide street of stores, and other streets with trees and old houses, and yellow wheat fields all around as far as you could see. It was pretty hot, and I was glad to sit down in the bus depot while I went through the thin little phone book. There were 3 Graham families in the book, but the first one I called was the right one, Miss Isla Graham. She talked fast and excited, and said she'd come right over, and I said I'd wait in front of the bus depot. I stood underneath the awning, looking down the quiet street and thinking that it sort of explained why Jim Clymer had always been such a quiet, slow-moving sort of guy. The place was sort of relaxed, like he'd been. A coupe pulled up, and Miss Graham opened the door. She was a brown-haired girl, not especially good-looking, but the kind you think of as a nice girl, a very nice girl. She said, "You look so tired that I feel guilty now about asking you to stop." "I'm all right," I said, "and it's no trouble stopping over a couple of places on my way back to Ohio." As we drove across the little town, I asked her if Jim hadn't had any family of his own here. "His parents were killed in a car crash years ago," Miss Graham said. "He lived with an uncle on a farm outside Grandview, but they didn't get along, and Jim came into town and got a job at the power station." She added as we turned a corner, "My mother rented him a room. That's how we got to know each other. That's how we got engaged." "Yeah, sure," I said. It was a big square house with a deep front porch and some trees around it. I sat down in a wicker chair, and Miss Graham brought her mother out. Her mother talked a little about Jim, how they missed him, and how she declared he'd been just like a son. When her mother went back in, Miss Graham showed me a little bunch of blue envelopes. These were the letters I got from Jim. There weren't very many of them, and they weren't very long. We were only allowed to send one 30-word message every 2 weeks, I told her. There are a couple of thousand of us out there, and they couldn't let us jam up the message transmitter all the time. It was wonderful how much Jim could put into just a few words, she said, and handed me some of them. I read a couple. One said, "I have to pinch myself to realize that I'm one of the first Earthmen to stand on an alien world. At night, in the cold, I look up at the green star that's Earth and can't quite realize I've helped an age-old dream come true." Another one said, "This world's grim and lonely and mysterious. We don't know much about it yet. So far nobody's seen anything living but the lichens that Expedition 1 reported. But there might be anything here." Miss Graham asked me, "Was that all there was? Just lichens?" "That and 2 or 3 kinds of queer cactus things," I said, "and rock and sand. That's all." As I read more of those little blue letters, I found that now that Jim was gone, I knew him better than I ever had. There was something about him I'd never suspected. He was romantic inside. We hadn't suspected it. He was always so quiet and slow. But now I saw that all the time he was more romantic about the thing we were doing than any of us. He hadn't let on. We'd have kidded him if he had. Our name for Mars, after we got sick of it, was The Hole. We always talked about it as The Hole. I could see now that Jim had been too shy of our kidding to ever let us know that he glamorized the thing in his mind. "This was the last one I got from him before his sickness," Miss Graham said. "That one said, 'I'm starting north tomorrow with one of the mapping expeditions. We'll travel over country no human has ever seen before.'" I nodded. "I was on that party myself. Jim and I were on the same half-track." "He was thrilled by it, wasn't he, Sergeant?" I wondered. I remembered that trip, and it was hell. Our job was simply to run a preliminary topographical survey, checking with Geigers for possible uranium deposits. It wouldn't have been so bad if the sand hadn't started to blow. It wasn't sand like Earth sand. It was ground to dust by billions of years of blowing around that dry world. It got inside your breathing mask, and your goggles, and the engines of the half-tracks, in your food and water and clothes. There was nothing for 3 days but cold and wind and sand. Thrilled? Ha! I'd have laughed at that before. But now, I didn't know. Maybe Jim had been at that. He had lots of patience, a lot more than I ever had. Maybe he glamorized that hellish trip into wonderful adventure on a foreign world. "Sure, he was thrilled," I said. "We all were. Anybody would be." Miss Graham took the letters back and then said, "You had Martian sickness too, didn't you?" I said, yes, I had, just a touch, and that was why I'd had to spend a stretch in reconditioning hospital when I got back. She waited for me to go on, and I knew I had to. They don't know yet if it's some sort of virus, or just the effect of Martian conditions on Earthmen's bodies. It hit 40% of us. It wasn't really so bad. Fever and dopiness mostly. When Jim got it, was he well cared for? She asked. Her lips were quivering a little. Sure, he was well cared for. He got the best care there was. I lied. The best care there was? That was a laugh. The first cases got decent care, maybe, but they'd never figured on so many coming down. There wasn't any room in our little hospital. They just had to stay in their bunks in the aluminum Quonsets when it hit them. All our doctors but one were down, and 2 of them died. We'd been on Mars 6 months when it hit us, and the loneliness had already got us down. All but 4 of our rockets had gone back to Earth, and we were alone on a dead world, our little town of Quonsets huddled together under that hateful, brassy sky, and beyond it the sand and rocks that went on forever. You go up to the North Pole and camp there and find out how lonely that is. It was worse out there, a lot worse. The first excitement was gone long ago, and we were tired and homesick in a way nobody was ever homesick before. We wanted to see green grass, and real sunshine, and women's faces, and hear running water. And we wouldn't until Expedition 3 came to relieve us. No wonder guys blew their tops out there. And then came Martian sickness on top of it. We did everything for him that we could, I said. Sure we had. I could still remember Walter and me tramping through the cold night to the hospital to try to get a medic, while Breck stayed with him, and how we couldn't get one. I remember how Walter had looked up at the blazing sky as we tramped back and shaken his fist at the big green star of Earth. People up there are going to dances tonight, watching shows, sitting around in warm rooms laughing. Why should good men have to die out here to get them uranium for cheap power? Can it? I told him tiredly. Jim's not going to die. A lot of guys got over it. The best care there was, that was real funny. All we could do was wash his face and give him the pills the medic left and watch him get weaker every day till he died. Nobody could have done more for him than was done, I told Miss Graham. I'm glad, she said. I guess it's just one of those things. When I got up to go, she asked me if I didn't want to see Jim's room. They'd kept it for him just the same, she said. I didn't want to, but how are you going to say so? I went up with her and looked and said it was nice. She opened a big cupboard. It was full of neat rows of old magazines. They're all the old science fiction magazines he read when he was a boy, she said. He always saved them. I took one out. It had a bright cover with a spaceship on it, not like our rockets, but a streamlined thing, and the rings of Saturn in the background. When I laid it down, Miss Graham took it up and put it back carefully into its place in the row, as though somebody was coming back who wouldn't like to find things out of order. She insisted on driving me back to Omaha and out to the airport. She seemed sorry to let me go, and I suppose it was because I was the last real tie to Jim, and when I was gone it was all over then for good. I wondered if she'd get over it in time, and I guessed she would. People do get over things. I supposed she'd marry some other nice guy, and I wondered what they'd do with Jim's things, with all those old magazines nobody was ever coming back to read. 3. I would never have stopped at Chicago at all if I could have got out of it, for the last person I wanted to talk to anybody about was Walter Millis. It would be too easy for me to make a slip and let out stuff nobody was supposed to know. But Walter's father had called me at the hospital a couple of times. The last time he called, he said he was having Breck's parents come down from Wisconsin so they could see me too. So what could I do then but say, yes, I'd stop. But I didn't like it at all, and I knew I'd have to be careful. Mr. Millis was waiting at the airport and shook hands with me and said what a big favor I was doing them all, and how he appreciated my stopping when I must be anxious to get back to my own home and parents. That's all right, I said. My dad and mother came out to the hospital to see me when I first got back. He was a big, fine-looking, important sort of man, with a little bit of the stuffed shirt about him, I thought. He seemed friendly enough, but I got the feeling he was looking at me and wondering why I'd come back, and his son Walter hadn't. Well, I couldn't blame him for that. His car was waiting, a big car with a driver, and we started north through the city. Mr. Millis pointed out a few things to me to make conversation, especially a big atomic power station we passed. It's only one of thousands strung all over the world, he said. They're going to transform our whole economy. This Martian uranium will be a big thing, Sergeant. I said yes, I guessed it would. I was sweating blood, waiting for him to start asking about Walter, and I didn't know yet just what I could tell him. I could get myself in Dutch plenty if I opened my big mouth too wide, for that one thing that had happened to Expedition 2 was supposed to be strictly secret, and we'd all been briefed on why we had to keep our mouths shut. But he let it go for the time being, and just talked other stuff. I gathered that his wife wasn't too well, and that Walter had been their only child. I also gathered that he was a very big shot in business, and dough-heavy. I didn't like him. Walter I'd liked plenty, but his old man seemed a pretty pompous person, with his heavy business talk. He wanted to know how soon I thought Martian uranium would come through in quantity, and I said I didn't think it'd be very soon. Expedition 1 only located the deposits, I said, and 2 just did mapping and setting up a preliminary base. Of course, the thing keeps expanding, and I hear 4 will have 100 rockets. But Mars is a tough setup. Mr. Millis said decisively that I was wrong, that the world was power-hungry, that it would be pushed a lot faster than I expected. He suddenly quit talking business and looked at me and asked, "Who was Walter's best friend out there?" He asked it sort of apologetically. He was a stuffed shirt, but all my dislike of him went away then. "Breck Jürgen," I told him. Breck was our sergeant. He sort of held our squad together, and he and Walter cottoned to each other from the first. Mr. Millis nodded, but didn't say anything more about it. He pointed out the window at the distant lake, and said we were almost to his home. It wasn't a home, it was a big mansion. We went in, and he introduced me to Mrs. Millis. She was a limp, pale-looking woman who said she was glad to meet one of Walter's friends. Somehow, I got the feeling that even though he was a stuffed shirt, he felt it about Walter a lot more than she did. He took me up to a bedroom and said that Breck's parents would arrive before dinner, and that I could get a little rest before then. I sat looking around the room. It was the plushiest one I'd ever been in, and seeing this house and the way these people lived, I began to understand why Walter had blown his top more than the rest of us. He'd been a good guy, Walter, but high-tempered, and I could see now he'd been a little spoiled. The discipline at training base had been tougher on him than on most of us, and this was why. I sat and dreaded this dinner that was coming up, and looked out the window at a swimming pool and tennis court, and wondered if anybody ever used them now that Walter was gone. It seemed a queer thing for a fellow with a setup like this to go out to Mars and get himself killed. I took the satin cover off the bed so my shoes wouldn't dirty it, and lay down and closed my eyes, and wondered what I was going to tell them. The trouble was, I didn't know what story the officials had given them. The commanding officer regrets to inform you that your son was shot down like a dog. They'd never got any telegram like that, but just what line had been handed them. I wished I'd had a chance to check on that. Damn it, why didn't all these people let me alone? They started it all going through my mind again, and the psychos had told me I ought to forget it for a while, but how could I? It might be better just to tell them the truth. After all, Walter wasn't the only one who'd blown his top out there. In that grim last couple of months, plenty of guys had gone around sounding off. Expedition 3 isn't coming. We're stuck, and they don't care enough about us to send help. That was the line of talk. You heard it plenty in those days. You couldn't blame the guys for it either. A fourth of us down with Martian sickness, the little grave markers clotting up the valley beyond the ridge, rations getting thin, medicine running low, everything running low, all of us watching the sky for rockets that never came. There'd been a little hitch back on Earth, Colonel Nichols explained. He was our CO, now that General Rayan had died. There was a little delay, but the rockets would be on their way soon. We'd get relief, we just had to hold on. Holding on, that's what we were doing. Nights we'd sit in the Quonset and listen to Lassen coughing in his bunk, and it seemed like wind giants, cold giants were bawling and laughing around our little huddle of shelters. "Damn it, if they're not coming, why don't we go home?" Walter said. "We've still got the 4 rockets. They could take us all back." Breck's serious face got graver. "Look, Walter, there's too much of that stuff being talked around. Lay off. Can you blame the men for talking it? We're not storybook heroes. If they've forgotten about us back on Earth, why do we just sit and take it?" "We have to," Breck said. 3 will come." I've always thought that it wouldn't have happened what did happen if we hadn't had that false alarm. The one that set the whole camp wild that night with guys shouting, "3's here! The rockets landed over west of Rock Ridge." Only when they charged out there, they found they hadn't seen rockets landing at all, but a little shower of tiny meteors burning themselves up as they fell. It was the disappointment that did it, I think. I can't say for sure, because that same day was the day I conked out with Martian sickness, and the floor came up and hit me, and I woke up in the bunk with somebody giving me a hypo, and my head big as a balloon. I wasn't clear out. It was only a touch of it, but it was enough to make everything foggy, and I didn't know about the mutiny that was boiling up until I woke up once with Breck leaning over me, and saw he wore a gun and an MP brassard now. When I asked him how come, he said there'd been so much wild talk about grabbing the 4 rockets and going home that the MP force had been doubled, and Nichols had issued stern warnings. "Walter?" I said, and Breck nodded. "He's a leader, and he'll get hit with a court-martial when this is over. The blasted idiot." "I don't get it. He's got plenty of guts, you know that," I said. "Yes, but he can't take discipline. He never did take it very well. And now that the squeeze is on, he's blowing up. Well, see you later, Frank." I saw him later, but not the way I expected, for that was the day we heard the faint echo of shots, and then the alarm siren screaming, and men running, and half-tracks starting up in a hurry. And when I managed to get out of my bunk and out of the hut, they were all going toward the big rockets, and a corporal yelled to me from a jeep, "That's blown it! The damn fool swiped guns and tried to take over the rockets and make the crews fly 'em home." I could still remember the sickening slidings and bouncings of the jeep as it took us out there, the milling little crowd under the looming rockets, milling around and hiding something on the ground, and Major Viler yelling himself hoarse, giving orders. When I got to see what was on the ground, it was 7 or 8 men, and most of them dead. Walter had been shot right through the heart. They told me later it was because he'd been the leader, out in front, that he got it first of the mutineers. 1 MP was dead, and 1 was sitting with red all over the middle of his uniform, and that 1 was Breck, and they were bringing a stretcher for him now. The corporal said, "Hey, that's Jürgen, your squad leader." And I said, "Yes, that's him." Funny how you can't talk when something hits you. How you just say words like, "Yes, that's him." Breck died that night without ever regaining consciousness, and there I was, still half sick myself, and with Lassen dying in his bunk, and 5 of us were all that was left of Squad 14, and that was that. How could HQ let a thing like that get known? A fine advertisement it would be for recruiting more Mars expeditions if they told how guys on 2 cracked up and did a crazy thing like that. I didn't blame them for telling us to keep it top secret. Anyway, it wasn't something we'd want to talk about. But it sure left me in a fine spot now, a sweet spot. I was going down to talk to Breck's parents and Walter's parents, and they'd want to know how their sons died, and I could tell them, "Your sons probably killed each other out there." Sure, I could tell them that, couldn't I? But what was I going to tell them? I knew HQ had reported those casualties as accidental deaths, but what kind of accident? Well, it got late and I had to go down, and when I did, Breck's parents were there. Mr. Jürgen was a carpenter, a tall, bony man with level blue eyes like Breck's. He didn't say much, but his wife was a little woman who talked enough for both of them. She told me I looked just like I did in the pictures of us Breck had sent home from training base. She said she had 3 daughters too, 2 of them married, and 1 of the married ones living in Milwaukee, and 1 out on the coast. She said that she'd named Breck after a character in a book by Robert Louis Stevenson, and I said I'd read the book in high school. "It's a nice name," I said. She looked at me with bright eyes and said, "Yes, it was a nice name." That was a fine dinner. They'd got everything they thought I might like, and all the best, and a maid served it, and I couldn't taste a thing. I ate. Then afterward, in the big living room, they all just sort of sat and waited, and I knew it was up to me. I asked them if they'd had any details about the accident, and Mr. Miller said, no, just accidental death was all they'd been told. Well, that made it easier. I sat there with all 4 of them watching my face and dreamed it up. I said it was one of those 1-in-a-million things. You see, more little meteorites hit the ground on Mars than here, because the air is so much thinner it doesn't burn them up so fast. And one hit the edge of the fuel dump, and a bunch of little tanks started to blow. I was down with the sickness, so I didn't see it, but I heard all about it. You could hear everybody breathing. It was so quiet as I went on with my yarn. A couple of guys were knocked out by the concussion, and would have been burned up if a few fellows hadn't got in there fast with foamite extinguishers. They kept it away from the big tanks, but another little tank let go, and Breck and Walter were 2 of the fellows who'd gone in, and they were killed instantly. When I'd got it told, it sounded corny to me, and I was afraid they'd never believe it, but nobody said anything, until Mr. Millis let out a sigh and said, "So that was it. Well, if it had to be, it was mercifully quick, wasn't it?" I said yes, it was quick. Only, I can't see why they couldn't have let us know. It doesn't seem fair. I had an answer for that. It's hush-hush, because they don't want people to know about the meteor danger. That's why. Mrs. Millis got up and said she wasn't feeling so well, and would I excuse her, and she'd see me in the morning. The rest of us didn't seem to have much to say to each other, and nobody objected when I went up to my bedroom a little later. I was getting ready to turn in when there was a knock on the door. It was Breck's father, and he came in and looked at me steadily. "It was just a story, wasn't it?" he said. I said, "Yes, it was just a story." His eyes bored into me, and he said, "I guess you've got your reasons. Just tell me one thing. Whatever it was, did Breck behave right?" "He behaved like a man all the way," I said. "He was the best man of us, first to last." He looked at me, and I guess something made him believe me. He shook hands and said, "All right, son, we'll let it go." I'd had enough. I wasn't going to face them again in the morning. I wrote a note, thanking them all and making excuses, and then went down and slipped quietly out of the house. It was late, but a truck coming along picked me up, and the driver said he was going near the airport. He asked me what it was like on Mars, and I told him it was lonesome. I slept in a chair at the airport, and I felt better, for next day I'd be home, and it would be over. That's what I thought. 4. It was getting toward evening when we reached the village, for my father and mother hadn't known I was coming on an earlier plane, and I'd had to wait for them up at Cleveland Airport. When we drove into Market Street, I saw there was a big painted banner stretching across. "Harmonville welcomes home its spaceman." Spaceman. That was me. The newspapers had started calling us that, I guess, because it was a short word good for headlines. Everybody called us that now. We'd sat cooped up in a prison cell that flew, that was all, but now we were spacemen. There were bright uniforms clustered under the banner, and I saw that it was the high school band. I didn't say anything, but my father saw my face. "Now, Frank, I know you're tired, but these people are your friends, and they want to show you a real welcome." That was fine, only it was all gone again, the relaxed feeling I'd been beginning to get as we drove down from Cleveland. This was my home country, this old Ohio country with its neat little white villages and fat, rolling farms. It looked good in June. It looked very good, and I'd been feeling better all the time. And now I didn't feel so good, for I saw that I was going to have to talk some more about Mars. Dad stopped the car under the banner, and the high school band started to play, and Mr. Robinson, who was the Chevrolet dealer, and also the mayor of Harmonville, got into the car with us. He shook hands with me and said, "Welcome home, Frank. What was it like out on Mars?" I said, "It was cold, Mr. Robinson. Awful cold. You should have been here last February." he said. 18 below, nearly a record. He leaned out and gave a signal, and Dad started driving again, with the band marching along in front of us and playing. We didn't have far to go, just down Market Street under the big old maples, past the churches and the old white houses, to the square white Grange Hall. There was a little crowd in front of it, and they made a sound like a cheer, not a real loud one. You know how people can be self-conscious about really cheering, when we drove up. I got out and shook hands with people I didn't really see, and then Mr. Robinson took my elbow and took me on inside. The seats were all filled, and people standing up, and over the little stage at the far end, they'd fixed up a big floral decoration. There was a globe all of red roses with a sign above it that said Mars, and beside it a globe all of white roses that said Earth, and a little rocket ship made out of flowers was hung between them. "The Garden Club fixed it up," said Mr. Robinson. "Nearly everybody in Harmonville contributed flowers." "It sure is pretty," I said. Mr. Robinson took me by the arm, up onto the little stage, and everyone clapped. They were all people I knew, people from the farms near ours, my high school teachers and all that. I sat down in a chair, and Mr. Robinson made a little speech about how Harmonville boys had always gone out when anything big was doing, how they'd gone to the War of 1812 and the Civil War and the 2 World Wars, and how now one of them had gone to Mars. He said, "Folks have always wondered what it's like out there on Mars, and now here's one of our own Harmonville boys come back to tell us all about it." And he motioned me to get up, and I did, and they clapped some more, and I stood wondering what I could tell them. And all of a sudden, as I stood there wondering, I got the answer to something that had always puzzled us out there. We'd never been able to understand why the fellows who had come back from Expedition 1 hadn't tipped us off how tough it was going to be. And now I knew why. They hadn't, because it would have sounded as if they were whining about all they'd been through, and now I couldn't for the same reason. I looked down at the bright, interested faces, the faces I'd known almost all my life, and I knew that what I could tell them was no good anyway. For they'd all read those newspaper stories about the exotic red planet and heroic spacemen, and if anyone tried to give them a different picture now, it would just upset them. I said, "It was a long way out there, but flying space is a wonderful thing. Flying right off the Earth, into the stars. There's nothing quite like it." Flying space, I called it. It sounded good and thrilling. How could they know that flying space meant lying strapped in that blind stokehold, listening to Joe Vallinez dying, and praying that it wouldn't be our rocket that cracked up? And it's a wonderful thrill to come out of a rocket and step on a brand new world, to look up at a different-looking sun, to look around at a whole new horizon. Yes, it was wonderful. Especially for the guys in Rockets 7 and 9 who got squashed like flies and lay around there on the sand moaning, "First aid." Sure, it was a big thrill for them, and for us who had to try to help them. There were hardships out there, but we all knew that a big job had to be done. That's a nice word, too. Hardships. It's not coarse and ugly like fellows coughing their hearts out from too much dust. It's not like having your best friend die of Martian sickness right in the room you sleep in. It's a nice, cheerful word, hardships. And the only way we could get the job done, away out there so far from Earth, was by teamwork. Well, that was true enough in its way. And what was the use of spoiling it by telling them how Walter and Breck had died? The job's going on. And Expedition 3 is building a bigger base out there right now, and 4 will start soon. And it'll mean plenty of uranium, plenty of cheap atomic power, for all Earth. That's what I said, and I stopped there. But I wanted to go on and add, and it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth all those guys, all the hell we went through, just to get cheap atomic power so you people can run more electric washers and television sets and toasters. But how? Are you going to stand up and say things like that to people you know, people who like you? And who was I to decide? Maybe I was wrong anyway. Maybe lots of things I'd had and never thought about had been squeezed out of other good guys back in the past. I wouldn't know. Anyway, that was all I could tell them, and I sat down, and there was a big lot of applause. And I realized then that I'd done right. I told them just what they wanted to hear, and everyone was all happy about it. Then things broke up, and people came up to me, and I shook a lot more hands. And finally, when I got outside, it was dark, soft, summery dark, the way I hadn't seen it for a long time. And my father said we ought to be getting on home so I could rest. I told him, "You folks drive on ahead, and I'll walk. I'll take the short cut. I'd sort of like to walk through town." Our farm was only a couple of miles out of the village, and the short cut across Heller's farm I'd always taken when I was a kid was only a mile. Dad didn't think maybe I ought to walk so far, but I guess he saw I wanted to, so they went on ahead. I walked on down Market Street, and around the little square, and the maples and elms were dark over my head, and the flowers on the lawn smelled the way they used to, but it wasn't the same either. I'd thought it would be, but it wasn't. When I cut off past the Oddfellows' Hall, beyond it I met Hobe Evans, the garage hand at the Ford place, who was humming along half-tight, the same as always on a Saturday night. "Hello, Frank. Heard you were back," he said. I waited for him to ask the question they all asked, but he didn't. He said, "Boy, you don't look so good. Want a drink?" He brought out a bottle, and I had one out of it, and he had one, and he said he'd see me around and went humming on his way. He was feeling too good to care much where I'd been. I went on in the dark, across Heller's pasture, and then along the creek under the big old willows. I stopped there like I'd always stopped when I was a kid, to hear the frog noises, and there they were, and all the June noises, the night noises, and the night smells. I did something I hadn't done for a long time. I looked up at the starry sky, and there it was, the same little red dot I'd peered at when I was a kid, and read those old stories, the same red dot that Breck and Jim and Walter and I had stared away at on nights at training base, wondering if we'd ever really get there. Well, they'd got there, and weren't ever going to leave it now, and there'd be others to stay with them, more and more of them as time went by. But it was the ones I knew that made the difference, as I looked up at the red dot. I wished I could explain to them somehow why I hadn't told the truth, not the whole truth. I tried, sort of, to explain. I didn't want to lie, I said, but I had to. At least, it seemed like I had to. I quit it. It was crazy, talking to guys who were dead and 40 million miles away. They were dead, and it was over, and that was that. I quit looking up at the red dot in the sky, and started on home again. But I felt as though something was over for me, too. It was being young. I didn't feel old, but I didn't feel young either, and I didn't think I ever would, not ever again. In the world's dusk. The city Zur reared its sombre towers and minarets of black marble into the ruddy sunset, a great mass of climbing spires circumvallated by a high black wall. 12 gates of massive brass opened in that wall, and outside it there lay the white salt desert that now covered the whole of earth. A cruel, glaring plain that stretched eye-achingly to the horizons, Its monotony was broken by no hill or valley or sea. Long ago the last seas had dried up and disappeared, and long ago the ages of geological gradation had smoothed mountain and hill and valley into a featureless blank. As the sun sank lower, it struck a shaft of red light across the city's ore into a great hall in the topmost spire. The crimson rays cut through the shadowy gloom of the dim, huge room and bathed the sitting figure of Galos Gan. Brooding in the ruddy glow, Galos Gan looked out across the desert to the sinking sun and said, "It is another day. The end comes soon." Chin in hand he brooded, and the sun sank, and the shadows in the great hall deepened and darkened about him. Out in the dusking sky blossomed the stars, and they peered down through the portico like taunting white eyes at him. And it seemed to him that he heard their thin, silvery star voices cry mockingly across the sky to each other, "The end comes soon," to the race of Galos Gan. For Galos Gan was the last man of all men. Sitting alone in his darksome hall high in sombre Zor, he knew that nowhere around the desert globe did there move another human shape, nor echo another human voice. He was that one about whom during anticipatory ages a fearful, foreboding fascination had clung, the final survivor. He tasted a loneliness no other man had ever known, for it was his to brood upon all the marching millions of men who had gone before him, and who were now no more. He could look back across the millions of years to the tumultuous youth of Earth, in whose warm seas had spawned the first protoplasmic life which, under the potent influences of cosmic radiation, had evolved through more and more complex animal forms into the culminating form of man. He could mark how man had risen through primeval savagery to world civilization that had finally given men mighty powers and had lengthened their lifespan to centuries. And he could mark, too, how the grim, grinding mechanism of natural forces had in the end brought doom to the fair cities of that golden age. Steadily, silently, inexorably, through the ages the hydrosphere or water envelope of Earth had slowly dwindled due to the loss of its particles into space from molecular dispersion. The seas had dried up as the millions of years had passed, and salt deserts had crept across the world, and men had seen the end close at hand for their race, and because they saw it, they ceased to bring forth children. They were weary of the endless, hopeless struggle, and they would not listen to the pleadings of Galos Gan, their greatest scientist, who alone among them yearned to keep the dying race alive. And so, in their weariness, the last generation of them had passed away, and in the world was left no living man but the unyielding Galos Gan. In his dark hall high in Zor, Galos Gan sat huddled in his robes, brooding upon these things, his withered face and black, living eyes unchanging. Then, at last, he stood erect. He strode with his robes swirling about him onto the balcony outside, and in the darkness he looked up at the mocking white eyes of the stars. He said, "You think that you look down on the last of men, that all the glories of my race are a story that is told and ended, but you are wrong. I am Galos Gan, the greatest man of all the men that have lived on earth, and it is my unconquerable will that my race shall not die, but shall live on to greater glories." The white stars were silent, wheeling with cynical imperturbability over the deserts beyond night-shrouded Zor. And Galos Gan raised his hand toward Rigel and Canopus and Achenar in a gesture pregnant with defiance and menace. "Somewhere and somehow I will find means to keep the race of man living on," he cried to them. "Yes, and the day will come when our seed will yoke you and all your worlds in submissive harness to man." Then Galos Gan, filled with that determination, came to a great resolve, and went to his laboratories and procured certain instruments and cryptic mechanisms. Holding them inside his robes, he went down from the tower and walked through the dark streets of the city Zur. Very small and alone he seemed as he wended through the dim starlight and glooming shadows of the mighty city's ways, yet proudly he stalked, for unconquerable defiance to fate flamed in his heart and vitalized his brain with unshakable resolve. He came to the low, squat structure that he sought, and its door opened with a sighing sound as he approached. He entered, and there in a small dark room was a stair down which he went. The coils of that spiral stair dropped into a great subterranean hall of black marble, illuminated by a feeble blue light that had no visible source. When Galos Gan stepped at last on its tessellated tile floor, he stood looking along the oblong hall. Upon its far-stretching walls were 100 high square panels that bore in painted pictures the story of mankind. The first of those panels showed the primal protoplasmic life from which man had descended, and the last of the panels displayed this very subterranean chamber. For in crypt set into the floor of this hall there lay the dead people of the city Zur, who had been the last generation of mankind. There was one last empty crypt that waited for Galos Gan when he should lie down in it to die, and since this was the last chapter of mankind's story, it had been pictured in the last panel. But Galos Gan disregarded the painted walls and strode along the hall, opening the crypts in the floor one after another. He worked on until at last before him lay the scores of dead men and women, their bodies perfectly preserved, so that they seemed sleeping. Galos Gan said to them, "It is my thought that even you who are not now living can mayhap be used to keep mankind from perishing. It seems an ill thing to disturb you in the peace of death, but nowhere else save in death can I find those I must have to perpetuate mankind." Then Galos Gan began to work upon the bodies of the dead, summoning up from his mighty resolution superhuman scientific powers, which even he had hitherto never possessed. By supreme chemical achievement he synthesized new blood, with which he filled the wasted veins of the bodies, and by powerful electric stimulants and glandular injections he set their hearts to beating convulsively, and then regularly. And as their hearts pumped the new blood through their bodies to their perfectly preserved brains, the dead regained slow consciousness and staggered upright and looked dazedly at one another and at the watching Galos Gan. Galos Gan felt a mighty pride and exultation as he looked at these strong men and fair women whom he had brought back from death. He said to them, "I have recalled you to life, because I have resolved that our race shall not come to an end and be forgotten of the universe. It is my determination that mankind shall continue, and through you I shall effect this." The jaws of one of the staring men moved stiffly, and from between them came the rusty accents of a voice long unused. "What madness of yours is this, Galos Gan? You have given us the semblance of life, but we are still dead, and how can we who are dead prolong the life of man?" "You move and speak, therefore you are living," insisted Galos Gan. "You shall mate together and bring forth sons, and they shall be the progenitors of new peoples." The dead man said hollowly, "You strive against the inevitable like a child breaking his hands against a door of marble. It is the law of the universe that everything which exists must come some day to an end. Planets wither and die and fall back into their parent suns, and suns strike one against the other and are transformed into nebulae, and the nebulae last not but in turn condense into other suns and worlds that in their own turn must die. How shall you hope amid this universal law of death to keep the race of man forever living? We have lived a fair life for many million years. We have struggled and won and lost, have laughed in the sunlight and dreamed under the stars, have played our part in the mighty drama of eternity. Now it is time we pass to our appointed end." As the dead man finished speaking, a hollow, low whisper of assent went up from all the other staring dead. "Aye," they said, "it is time the tired sons of men rested in the blessed sleep of death." But the brow of Galos Gan was dark with resolve, and his eyes flashed, and his form stiffened with unchangeable will. "Your words avail you nothing," he told the dead. "Despite your icy counsels of surrender, I am determined that man shall live on to challenge the blind laws of the cosmos. Therefore you shall obey me, for well you know that with my powers and science I can force you to my will. You are not dead now, but living, and you shall repeople the city Zur." Galos Gan, with these words, walked to the spiral stair and started up its winding way. And helplessly, dully submissive, the dead men and women followed him up the stair, walking stiffly with a confused, heavy trampling up the steps. A strange spectacle it was when Galos Gan led his silent host out into the starlit streets of the city. And by day and by night thereafter was Zur a weird sight, peopled again by those who once had peopled it before they died. For Galos Gan decreed that they should live in the same buildings in which they had lived before, and those that had been husbands and wives before should be husbands and wives now, and in all things they should dwell as they had before their deaths. So all day beneath the hot sun the dead went to and fro in Zur and pretended that they were truly living. They walked stiffly in the streets and gave one another greeting in their grating, rusty voices, and those that had had trades in old time followed those trades now, so that the cheery sounds of work and life rang in the city. By night they thronged into the great theatre of the city and sat in stiff immobility, while those who had been dancers and singers performed with heavy clumsiness on the stage, and the dead audience applauded and laughed, and their laughter was a strange sound. And at night, when the stars peered curiously down at Zur, those of them who had been young men and maidens walked apart, and with stiff and uncouth gestures made pantomime of love, and spoke words of love to one another. And they wedded one another, for that was the decree of Galos Gan. In his high tower, Galos Gan watched as moon after moon was born and waxed and died. Great hope was his as the months passed one by one in the dead tenanted city. He said to himself, "These are not wholly living. Something there was that my powers could not bring back from death. But even such as they are, they will serve to give mankind a new start in the universe." The slow months passed, and at last, to one of the dead couples living in the city, a child was born. High flared the hopes of Galos Gan when he heard, and great was his excitement as he hastened through the city to see. But when he saw the child, he felt his heart grow cold. For this infant was like the parents of whom it was born. It was not wholly living. It moved and saw and uttered sounds, but its movements and cries were stiff and strange, and its eyes had death behind them. Not wholly yet did Galos Gan give up hope in his great plan. He waited for another child to be born, but the next child too was the same. Then indeed did his faith and hope perish. He called the dead citizens of Zor together, and spoke to them. He said, "Why do you not bring forth holy living children, seeing that you yourselves are now living? Do you do this but to thwart me?" Out of the gaunt-eyed throng, a dead man answered him, "Death cannot bring forth life any more than light can be born of darkness. Despite your words, we know that we are dead, and we can give birth only to death. Now be convinced of the futility of your mad scheme, and allow us to return to the peace of death, and let the race of man come peacefully to its destined end." Galosgan told them darkly, "Return then to the nothingness you crave, since you cannot serve my purpose. But know that not now and not ever shall I relinquish my purpose to perpetuate the race." The dead answered him not, but turning their backs upon him moved in a silent, trampling throng through the streets of the city toward that low, squat building which they knew. They passed without any word down the spiral stair to the blue-lit chamber of the crypts, and there each lay down once more in the crypt that was his, and the two women who had given birth lay down with their strange, dead little infants at their breasts. Then each drew over his crypt the stone lid that had covered it, until all were covered once more. And again there was solemn silence in the pictured burial chamber of Zor. Up in his high tower, Galosgan had watched them go, and there for 2 days and nights he brooded over the again silent city. He said to himself, "It seems my hope was vain, and that in truth humanity dies with me, since those who are dead cannot be the progenitors of future men. For where in all the world are there any living men and women such as alone will serve my ends?" This he said, and then of a sudden a thought struck him that was like a dazzling and perilous lightning flash across the brooding darkness of his mind. His brain well-nigh reeled at the audacity of the thing it had suddenly conceived, yet such was the desperation of his purpose that he seized quakingly upon even this unearthly expedient. He muttered to himself, "There are no living men and women in the world today. But what of the trillions of men and women who have existed on earth in the past? Those trillions are separated from me by the abyss of time. Yet if I could somehow reach across that abyss, I could draw many living people out of the past into dead Zor." The brain of Galosgan fired to that staggering thought, and he, the greatest scientist Earth had ever possessed, began that night the audacious attempt to draw across the gulf of ages living men and women who would father a new race. Day after day, as the sun blazed on silent Zor, and night after night, as the majestic stars wheeled above it, the withered scientist toiled in his laboratories. And gradually there grew up the great cylindrical mechanism of brass and quartz that was to pierce time. At last, the mighty mechanism was finished, and Galosgan prepared to begin his unthinkably daring attempt. Despite the inflexibility of his resolve, his soul quaked within him as he laid hand upon the switches that controlled the great machine. For well he knew that in attempting to thrust an arm across the awful gulf of time, he was so outraging and rending the inmost frame of the cosmos that vast cataclysm might well result. Yet Galosgan, driven by his unshaken determination, closed the switches with a trembling hand. There came a crash of cosmic thunder, and a hissing of blinding white force that filled the cylinder, and all the dead city Zor rocked strangely on its foundations, as though shaken by a mighty wind. Galosgan was aware that the titanic forces he had loosed were tearing through space and time itself inside that cylinder, and arriving the hitherto inviolate dimensions of the universe. The white force flamed, and the thunder crashed, and the city rocked until at last he convulsively opened the switches again. Then the glare and rumbling and rocking died, and as Galos Gan stared into the cylinder, he cried in shrill triumph, "I have succeeded! The brain of Galos Gan has triumphed over time and fate." For there in the cylinder stood a living man and woman who wore the grotesque cloth garments of ages before. He opened the door of the cylinder, and the man and woman came out with slow steps. Galos Gan told them exultantly, "I have brought you across time to be the fountainhead of a new generation. Be not afraid. You are but the first of very many people I shall bring out of the past in the same way." The man and woman looked at Galos Gan, and suddenly they laughed. Their laughter was not of mirth, but was a maniac shrieking. Wildly, insanely the man and woman laughed, and Galos Gan saw that they were both utterly mad. Then he understood. By dint of superhuman science, he had contrived to bring their living bodies across the gulf of ages unharmed, but in so doing he had destroyed their minds. Not any science beneath the sun could draw their minds over the abyss of time without wrecking them, for the mind is not of matter, and does not obey the laws of matter. Yet Galos Gan was so possessed of his mighty plan that he refused to relinquish it. "I will bring more across time," he told himself, "and surely some of them will come through with minds unharmed." So again and again, in the nights and days that followed, he operated the great mechanism, and with its potent grasp snatched many scores of men and women out of their proper time and brought them across the millenniums to Zor. But always, though he brought their bodies through unharmed, he could not bring their minds, so that it was only madmen and women who came from the cylinder, out of every age and land. These mad people dwelt in Zor in a most frightful fashion, roaming its streets so that no corner of the city was beyond the sound of their insane shrieking. They ascended the sombre towers and raved and gibbered from them at the dead city and at the barren desert beyond it. It seemed that even the insensate city grew fearful of the crazed horde whom it housed, for the city of the mad was more awful than had been the city of the dead. Finally, Galos Gan ceased to draw men and women out of the past, for he saw that never could he hope to bring them through sane. For a time, he strove to replace the minds of these crazed people which had been destroyed, but he saw that that too was beyond the power of any material science. Then, in that shrieking city of madness which was the last city on earth, Galos Gan grew afraid that he too was going mad. He felt a desire to scream with the others through the dark streets. So, in sick disgust and fear, he went forth and destroyed those mad people down to the last one, giving them the release of death. And Zor again knew silence as the last man solitary walked its ways. Finally, there came a day when Galos Gan walked onto his balcony and looked fixedly out over the white and barren desert. He said, "I sought to bring new men out of death, and then out of time, but neither from death nor time, it seems, can come those to prolong the race. How can I hope to produce men in a little moment of time when it required millions of years for the forces of nature to produce them? So I shall produce the new race in the way that the old was produced. I shall change the face of earth so that new life may spring from it as it did long ago, and in time that life will evolve once more into men. Animated by that colossal resolve, Galos Gan, the last and mightiest scientist of Earth, began an awesome task that would hitherto have never even been dreamed of by any man. He first assembled all the forces of which his race had had knowledge, and many of which he himself had discovered, and he devised even mightier forces, such as even a god might fear to unchain too lightly. Then Galos Gan loosed his powers and began to bore a shaft down into the solid lithosphere of the earth. Down through sandstone and granite and gneiss he bored, until he had passed down through the rock crust and was deep in the mighty core of nickel iron, which is the heart of the planet. In that iron core he constructed a great chamber which he fitted with the equipment and the mechanisms that he would require for the task ahead of him. And when everything he needed was in that deep chamber, he retired down to it, and then collapsed and closed the shaft that led up to the surface. Then Galos Gan began to shake the earth. From his deep chamber in the iron core, he loosed small impulses of force at exact intervals, and the period of rhythm of these impulses was timed with perfect accuracy to the period of rhythm of the earth. At first, the little impulses had no effect upon the vast globe of the planet, but little by little their effect accumulated and grew stronger, until finally the whole rocky crust of the lithosphere was shaking violently. These stresses and strains produced immense pressures and heats within the rocks, melting much of them into lava, and this molten lava burst upward in fiery masses all around the globe, as it had done when the earth was in its first youth. Galos Gan, in his deep-buried chamber, watched through his instruments and saw the changes taking place upon the surface of the earth. He saw the upthrust masses of molten magma give off their imprisoned gases, and observed those gases combining to form a new hydrosphere of water vapor clouds around the planet. The earth was passing through the same changes it had passed through long ago. As its molten surface began to cool, rain began to fall from the clouds and gathered upon the torn surface of the world in new seas. Galos Gan watched tensely with his far-seeing, marvelous instruments, and saw complex compounds being built up along the shores of the warm seas, from carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and other elements. And beneath the photosynthetic action of the sunlight, these organic compounds combined into the first beginnings of primal protoplasmic life. Galos Gan said then to himself, "The new cycle of Earth's life is started. The sun's radiation calls forth life from the inorganic elements, as it did ages ago in the past. That life must evolve upward under the same conditions in the same way, and in time men will evolve from it and will again people the earth." He calculated the ages that it would take for a new human race to evolve upon the face of Earth. Then he took a carefully measured quantity of a subtle drug which he had prepared, one which suspended indefinitely every vital function of the human body, and yet permitted it to remain living in a deathless sleep. He lay down upon his couch in the buried chamber inside the earth. "I will sleep now in suspended animation until the new race of man has evolved," said Galos Gan. "When I awake, Earth will again be crowded with the victorious and undying race of men, and I can go forth and look upon them, and then die in peace, knowing that man lives." So saying, he folded his arms upon his breast, and the drug took its effect upon him, and he slept. And it seemed to him that no sooner had his eyes closed and his consciousness darkened than he was awaking again, for in sleep an eternity and a moment are the same. For a little, Galosgan could not indeed believe that he had slept through the ages for which his drug had been calculated, but his chronometers that measured time by the transmutation of uranium showed him that indeed he had lain sleeping for many millions of years. Then he knew that he had come to the moment of his triumph, for in those slow millenniums must have evolved the new race of men that must now people the surface of the earth above him. His hand shook as he prepared to blast a new shaft up to the surface from his chamber. "Death is not far from me," said Galosgan. "But first, these eyes shall look on the new race which I have created to perpetuate the old." His forces pierced a shaft up through the rocky crust of the lithosphere to the surface, and borne by his powers, Galosgan rose up that shaft and emerged onto the face of earth, into the sunlight. He stood and looked about him. He was in the midst of a white salt desert that stretched monotonously to the horizons in all directions, and that had nowhere any hill or valley to break its blank expanse. A queer chill came upon the heart of Galosgan as he stood in the glaring sunlight of the lonely desert. Can it be, he asked himself, that the forces of nature have dried and worn the earth just as they did long ago? Even so, somewhere on earth must be the new races of men that time has evolved. He looked in one direction after another, and finally he saw on one horizon the distant spires of a city. His heart gladdened at that sight, and he moved toward that city with quick and eager expectation. But when he came close to the city, he was troubled anew, for it was a city of black marble towers and minarets belted by a high black wall, and in many ways it was very like the city Zor that long ago had perished. He came to one of its open gates and passed into the city, and like a man in a dream, he walked through the streets, turning his head this way and that. For this city was as empty of life as ancient Zor had been. Not in any of its courts or ways did there move one human shape, nor echo one human voice. And now a fatal foreboding and knowledge came upon Galosgan, and led him into the highest tower, and up to a dim and dusky hall at the tower's top. There at the end of the hall sat huddled in his robes a withered, shrunken man who seemed very near to death. Galosgan spoke to him in a strange voice and said, "Who are you, and where are the others of the races of men?" The other raised his swaying head, and peering blindly at Galosgan, he answered, "There are no others, for I am the last survivor of all the race of man. Millions of years ago, our life began in the protoplasm of the world's warm seas, and developed through many forms into man, and the civilization and power of man grew great. But the seas dried up, and as earth withered, our race withered and died also, until I alone am left in this dead city, and my own death is upon me." With these words, the shrunken, swaying man fell forward, and sighed once, and lay dead upon the floor. And Galosgan, the last man, looked across his body at the sinking sun.